Born in 1912, three Titanic-year babies who partied through the Great Depression while America starved. First, Barbara Woolworth Hutton.
Our Edna's getting married to a New York City stockbroker. One of the wealthiest and most influential fellows.
Frank, stop it.
Nothing wrong with a little bragging. Harry and I both came up the hard way. Children are our legacy. Here's to them.
For so many years, it was always a point of marriage for an heiress to marry a rich man and increase the family's wealth. And Edna Woolworth did just that. Edna Woolworth was the daughter of Frank Winfield Woolworth, the founder of the F.W. Woolworth Company. His stores were simply called Woolworth, and they were America's first chain of 5 and dime stores, meaning that all of the items in his stores were priced at 5 cents and 10 cents when he first started. His stores made him one of the richest men during the Gilded Age. He amassed a fortune of over $75 million, enough to leave his descendants financially stable for generations. And he is the grandfather of today's subject, the poor little rich girl. She inherited a chunk of that fortune. So how did she, one of the richest women in the world, die with only $3,500 in her bank account? It seems almost impossible, considering that she started out with over $40 million, more than $730 million adjusted for inflation in today's money in 2024. But when you factor in her own crazy spending with a string of husbands who didn't care about anything except for her money, it all seems a little more possible. The thought of her dying broke. The poor little rich girl is Barbara Hutton. She was born into wealth from both sides of her family, but it was the wealth from her mother's side that she became more known for. Barbara was often called the Woolworth heiress. You might be like me and old enough to remember that there was once a chain of discount retail stores called Woolworth. They were all over the United States, then eventually expanded to many other countries, including Canada, Mexico, England, and Germany. As a child, Barbara had access to more money than most people can imagine, but it was what she was lacking that was likely the biggest contributor to some horrible decisions that she made that led to her ultimate demise. Barbara didn't have love at home. Edna Woolworth, the daughter of Frank Winfield Woolworth, was Barbara's mother. Now that we know how Barbara came to be an heiress, back to Edna, her mother. Edna did what her father wanted her to do, marry that wealthy New York City stockbroker. And while the marriage looked good on paper and satisfied her family, she was miserable in it, and it might have played a role in her early death. We'll get there. Edna died when Barbara was only 4 years old, and Barbara's father, instead of trying to make up for her mother's absence, did the total opposite and neglected the poor child. He would pawn her off on governesses, servants, and other relatives in boarding schools. He never showed her any affection. The truth was that he hadn't really been good at showing his wife much affection either. Barbara's father, the fancy New York stockbroker, who seemed like such a prize to Frank Woolworth, was known to quite openly cheat on Edna. And you know that they say that girls marry some version of their fathers. Barbara was no exception to this rule, and boy oh boy did she ever know how to pick some rotten apples. But her husbands were typically worse than her father. Her father was only a cheater. Many of her husbands were cheaters and gold diggers. From the moment that she hit the newspapers as the second wealthiest debutante of the season of 1930, she was a scandal. For a little context, 1930 was also the start of the Great Depression, the worst economic downturn in history. So, while most families were struggling to eat a meal once a day, Barbara was having her coming out ball, one day of festivities that cost $60,000, a little over $1 million for us today. I'm sure that you can imagine that this did not make her a favorite among the poverty-stricken public. That sets the stage for today's subject, Barbara Hutton, the poor little rich girl. She became poorer, with each marriage, and there were 7 of them, by the way. Let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about the most scandalous people from yesteryear who make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I upload content. And please hit that thumbs up to support this video for free. Thank you. Now, on to why you are here. Barbara Woolworth Hutton was born on November 14, 1912, to parents Edna Woolworth and Franklin Laws Hutton. Her mother, Edna, was the daughter of Frank Winfield Woolworth, and from her mother's bloodline alone, she was set for life as far as money was concerned. Franklin, Barbara's father, co-founded the brokerage firm E.F. Hutton, and it was one of the largest financial firms in the country. Most men would have looked at his life and said that he had it all, but Franklin wanted more, especially when it came to women. He didn't care about being married to Edna Woolworth. He wanted other women, and he had other women, quite publicly and quite often. And it was said that Franklin's cheating was just too much for Edna to bear, so she took her own life. Before we go all the way there, I have to say that there are 3 causes of death that have been accepted as accurate, depending on who you ask. I'm going to start off with the 2 that did not demand a lot of attention. One was that Edna died from suffocation due to mastoiditis. In this scenario, Edna would have had an infection that went into the air cells of her skull behind her ear, and this would have caused her to suffocate. Another was that she died of heart disease. Now, the story that was more juicy for her peers to spread was that she had taken her own life because she'd had enough of her husband's cheating. And let me be clear, I'm not claiming to know which cause of death is the actual one. I'm just revealing to you what 3 totally different sets of sources had to say on the matter. But whichever one is correct, what we do know is that on May 2nd, 1917, Barbara Hutton found her mother's lifeless body in their suite at the Plaza Hotel. Barbara was only 4 years old at the time, and I'm sure that you can imagine that her life was never the same from that point. Her mother was only 33. It was easy for the public to believe the suicide rumor because Franklin's affairs that he had on his wife were not a secret, and who wouldn't eventually get fed up with a cheating spouse? Just 2 months before Edna passed away, the South Pasadena Record reported that Franklin took a trip from New York to California without his wife. I can't confirm or deny that he was spending time with another woman on this trip, but perhaps it does support the claim that Edna ended her life because of his cheating. Edna's death left behind only Franklin and Barbara and their tiny family. They had no other children, and because it was just the 2 of them, one might think that Franklin would have drawn his daughter even tighter to him so that they could help each other grieve. But no, he moved to California and sent Barbara to live with her grandfather, Frank Woolworth, the retail magnate. One can only imagine how hard it must have been for Frank to have to rear his granddaughter because his daughter was dead. It is so sad when parents outlive their children. I don't have any children, but I've seen parents who have lost their children just never recover. That's not the natural order of things, and that will happen again in this story. While Barbara was being cared for by her mother's father, her own father had moved to California. It really can start to seem like he was already building a new life there before his wife passed away. Franklin Hutton's communications with his daughter were minimal for all the years of her childhood. Meanwhile, back in New York, Barbara struggled to find stability. After her grandfather died in 1919, just 2 years after her mother, she spent the rest of her youth moving from one family member's mansion to the next, and a few schools here and there. Outside of that, she lived the life that wealthy girls of her era lived. She attended a couple of finishing schools for young ladies. There weren't a lot of educational opportunities for girls unless their parents made a decision to give their daughters a traditional education. But at finishing school, Barbara would learn everything that she needed to get along well in high society, things like etiquette and social graces. Barbara didn't have a lot of friends. But she had a cousin who was her closest confidant. His name was Jimmy Donahue. He was also an heir to part of the Woolworth fortune, and there's no doubt that he understood Barbara in a way that very few people could have. He shared the same struggle of being a very rich kid who was expected to excel in life just because he came from a lot of money. They both had upbringings that were not so pleasant and, for the most part, out of the spotlight. But when it was time for Barbara's name to start getting media attention because of her upcoming debut to society, Franklin, her father, showed up to foot the bill for it. He would show up one more time in her adult life, and when you hear what he did, you'll probably wish that he had just left her alone. Having a debutante ball thrown in her honor was nothing more than a standard rite of passage for a girl like Barbara, a girl who was born into wealth in New York City. By the time it was her turn for her ball, these coming out parties had been going on for decades, for daughters whose last names were Astor, Vanderbilt, and Rockefeller, and now, in 1930, it was her turn. It was unfortunate timing for Barbara that she just so happened to be turning 18 at the beginning of the Great Depression, and for that reason, which was completely out of her control, her society debut became an instant scandal. How on God's green earth could her father brag about spending $60,000 on a party, $7,000 on the music alone, when people were lined up at soup kitchens trying to stave off hunger pains till the next day, while a nation full of able-bodied men who were willing to work couldn't find jobs? The talk about Barbara's coming out gala seemed obscene under the circumstances, and the public made it known that they did not like it at all. The situation got so hot for Barbara that she had to leave the country and go to Europe for a while, just to escape the media attention. But make no mistake, her coming out party was extravagant, even by rich people's standards. It was held at the Ritz-Carlton, and the music was so expensive because her father had hired Rudy Vallee to play. He was one of the most popular singers of his day. He led his own big band, and he was well known all over the nation, not just New York. The ball was to last all night long, starting with a dinner party for 200, followed by a dance, which was followed by a breakfast party that started at dawn the next day. It sounds like a fabulous party. The rest of the country probably would have been celebrating with her in spirit if they'd had a little food and money of their own. Once the drama of the press had died down, another drama spun off from Barbara's debutante ball. Now, all of her potential suitors would know that she was on the market for marriage, and a young girl with a big inheritance was always a coveted find in that set. For a rich young man, she would make a great match because their families could combine their fortunes, and the two could become a real-life power couple. But the problem was that there weren't only young rich men hanging around at these debutante balls. There were also poor men with good names and sometimes even aristocratic titles searching for some young, foolish rich girl to fork over her money in order to shore up his family. These men were called fortune hunters, and they had their eyes on Barbara Woolworth Hutton from the start. They may or may not have known about how her father earned his money, but everyone knew what Woolworth was. I can't express how big the Woolworth brand became. For those potential mates of hers, locking her down would be like a present-day man being able to marry the daughter of the founder of Apple or Amazon and then have access to her money. Barbara's grandfather had built the tallest building in the world at the time. The Woolworth Building in New York City was the tallest skyscraper in the world from 1913 until the same year as Barbara's ball, 1930, when 40 Wall Street was built. Then the very next year came the Chrysler Building, which was later dwarfed by the Empire State Building in 1931. But the point is that Barbara came from big money and everyone knew it. And while it might sound like a lot of fun to have as much money as Barbara had, the truth was that it was isolating. People with pockets that deep never know who to trust, or if someone only pretends to love them but has ulterior motives. And poor Barbara, She had a habit of picking the guys who meant her no good at all. They only wanted what she could give them. They wanted her money. First, there was Alexis Mdivani. I'm sorry, that's actually Prince Alexis Mdivani. He came from a broke-ass, bankrupt family who were each doing well for themselves until there was civil unrest in their native Georgia, the Eurasian country, not the state, in the USA. Alexis was the youngest of 5 siblings. He was said to have not been particularly handsome, nor did he have a great manly physique, but he did have a lot of charm. After landing in America, his 2 sisters married for love. His 2 brothers married for money, and he followed in their footsteps. His brother David moved to Hollywood, where he was able to make $25 a week as a movie extra, but he didn't need to work anymore after he met and married Mae Murray, a movie actress who was at the height of her career. His other brother, Sergei, was able to ditch his job after meeting and marrying film actress and singer Pola Negri. Oddly, neither one of these ladies ever married again after being married to the Mdivani brothers. Then there was the baby brother Alexis. Barbara was his second wife. His first one was an Astor, Louise Astor Van Allen. The 2 women had been friends. You can imagine how tight those social circles get when people have that kind of money. But while Alexis was married to Barbara, Louise Astor was still in love with him. Some sources even say that he never divorced her. But while Louise was in love with Alexis, he was in love with Barbara's money. The pair got married in 1933, and their wedding night should have revealed to her everything that she needed to know about him. He refused to have sex with her that night because, in his words, she was too fat. They got divorced in 1935, but while they were married, she bought him some really expensive presents. There were polo ponies, expensive properties all over the country, and his prized possession, a Rolls Royce. And when they got divorced, Princess Barbara's main complaint was, "He doesn't appreciate me." Well, he appreciated her money, and he bragged about being able to walk away with all of those expensive presents she had given him throughout their very short marriage. He was able to walk away with it all: the houses, the horses, and the Rolls Royce. Plus, he demanded $1 million of Barbara's dollars in alimony, and he got it. After using her for material gain and to help him social climb, he was patting himself on the back for now being a millionaire in his own right. Well, karma came quickly for the prince. That Rolls Royce that he gloated about getting from Barbara, he was killed in it, just 3 months after the divorce was finalized. Here's what happened. He was visiting his sister in Spain. She and her husband were having a small party, and Alexis was attending with a woman he was dating. She needed to catch a train about 35 miles from his sister's house, so he left the party to take her. It was reported that he was speeding while driving in the foothills of the Pyrenees. He was going 85 miles per hour down these winding roads when his car struck a culvert, then plunged into a deep gully. Just as his sister's last guests were leaving, she got a phone call from authorities notifying her of the accident and asking her to come identify her brother's body. His companion suffered life-threatening injuries and was treated at a nearby hospital, but the reports said that it didn't appear that she would pull through. She was not named in the reports, and I don't know for certain if she survived her injuries or died from them. I couldn't look it up. Alexis's brothers were notified of his death. They were both in America and made plans to drop everything and get to Spain immediately. One of them was at a party at a country club when he got the news. No surprises there. It's not as if the brothers had a lot of pressing business to drop in order to leave the country. And Barbara was also contacted by the press for a comment. The reporter actually broke the news to her. Barbara responded with questions. "Are you sure?" And then, "When did it happen? Was he alone?" After it was confirmed that it was true, she said, quote, "I am terribly, terribly sorry. I am not surprised. I always felt something like this would happen. He drove like mad." End quote. By the way, by this time she was Countess Barbara. Yes, very shortly after her divorce, she had already gotten married again to another man with another title. Let's talk about him. He was Count Kurt von Haugwitz Reventlau, a German-born Danish count, descended from aristocratic military on both sides of his family, and like Alexis, he married Barbara and an Astor. But Count Kurt married the Astor after he married Barbara, and Barbara married him only one day after her divorce from Prince Alexis. The Count had something else in common with Prince Alexis. He would repeat the same pattern of courting Barbara. Woo her with presents and charm, pretend he loved her, then demand money from her. Now, unlike the prince, the Count's family wasn't completely poor. They still had a castle in Denmark, and he convinced Barbara to come live with him there. Maybe it didn't take much convincing, though. She would get to be a countess and live in a castle. I mean, how romantic does that sound? That's practically every little girl's fantasy. But there was one more condition. He would need for her to give up her American citizenship. And she did it. I should throw in here that Barbara was anorexic by this time. The fat comments from Prince Alexis really took a toll on her self-esteem. But anyway, this relationship with the Count, like most relationships, started out great. They even conceived a son in their first year together. After their son, Lance, was born, things went downhill from there. This marriage was particularly stressful for Barbara because the Count wanted to control every aspect of their son's life, where he would attend school and what type of religious upbringing he would have were decisions that he wanted to make without Barbara's input. Adding to her stress was trouble back home. In New York City, Woolworth salesgirls were on strike. They wanted more money. Their picket signs remarked on how different Barbara's life was from theirs. And there was nothing that Barbara could do about it. Her response to their cries was, quote, "Do people realize I have no more to do with running the Woolworth stores than I have running the British Empire?" End quote. Eventually, Count Kurt asked for divorce, custody of Lance, and a $2.5 million alimony payment from Barbara. Her fear was that Kurt only wanted custody because her son was an heir to a $20 million fortune from her. She feared that her son's life would mirror the worst parts of hers, being wanted by people only because of the money attached to his name. Well, she took action, legal action, and she didn't hold back. In 1935, when the Count was ready to throw in the towel on the marriage, Barbara went to London and filed for a restraining order and to have her American citizenship restored. You see, his request to have her give up her American citizenship came with consequences that she could see, like American newspapers marring her name for being unpatriotic. But the repercussion that she didn't foresee was that giving up her citizenship gave Count Kurt complete control over what happened to her and their son. She couldn't have seen this coming when she submitted to his will. She was in love with this man, and she thought that he was in love with her too. But he was just laying a trap to get her money. She got the help that she needed in London. Her request for a restraining order got approved, and the renewing of her American citizenship standing was in the works. She had Barbara's absentee father. Yes, this is where he rears his head again. Barbara had made it clear that her husband was cruel, controlling, and money-hungry. So she was taking every step that she could to get her son and herself away from him. Her father showed up to make sure that the couple worked out their issues and stayed together. The nerve of him. If he had been a decent husband and a loving father, maybe Barbara wouldn't have been so desperate for love from just anyone and falling for all these wrong men. But now, at this late stage in her life, he decided to show up and be her father. The Count was in Paris while all of the legal stuff was happening in London. Barbara's father flew to Paris to console his son-in-law and to speak to Barbara on the Count's behalf, asking her to consider making up with him. Barbara's father, Mr. Hutton, sat down for a meal with the Count when he was approached by a reporter. The reporter showed him cable communications showing that his son-in-law wanted $2.5 million from his daughter. His response was, quote, "All I can say is that these children have been in some sort of a misunderstanding. It's all mixed up and it's all too bad." End quote. Her father told the press that he planned on flying from Paris to London with his son-in-law to help facilitate a meeting between the couple so that they could get back on track. In other words, he was going to accompany his son-in-law on a mission to violate a restraining order, an action that could have put his own daughter and grandson's lives at risk. Long story short, this marriage ended in divorce, with Barbara having to shell out another big alimony payment. But there was a bright side. She got to return to America with her citizenship restored and her son safe and sound with her. No thanks to her father. She loved her son dearly, but she didn't want to have any more children. She would use anorexia as a method of birth control and unhealthy weight management for the rest of her life. Her divorce was finalized in 1938. Then she took a few years off from marriage. Barbara got married again in 1942, and this time it was to a famous man, Cary Grant. On July 8th, they eloped to Lake Arrowhead, California, and honestly, there is no scandal here. She loved him, and he loved her. But you know how they say that sometimes love just isn't enough? This seemed to be one of those situations, though she did divorce him on the ground of cruelty. But they never had a bad thing to say about each other publicly. She said that his career got in the way of their marriage, and she loved him the most because he was so sweet and gentle. They simply parted ways in 1945. He was reported to be her only husband who never asked her for alimony. Want to know what she did next? Listen to this line from the Buffalo News, quote, "After her third divorce, Woolworth heiress Barbara Hutton told the world, 'I'll never marry again because you can't go on being a fool forever.' And then went on being a fool forever." End quote. Enter Prince Igor. Barbara became a princess again in 1947 when she married Lithuanian Prince Igor Troubetzkoy. I'm sure that you already know how this romance went. He told her how beautiful she was, bought her some fancy trinkets, told her that he loved her, she believed it, they got married, then they got divorced. Prince Igor was different from Prince Alexis in the looks department. His dashing good looks were always remarked upon in the press. But Igor seemed to be like Alexis in every other way. When he was in Barbara's presence, he treated her cruelly. When he wasn't in her face being mean to her, he was neglecting her. When Barbara requested the divorce from him, her attorney told the Parisian court that Igor showed her, quote, "a lack of affection, lack of comprehension, and abandoned her to solitude," end quote. And to be clear, he had completely abandoned her. He wasn't just giving her the silent treatment at home. No, they had been living in a suite at the Hotel Ritz, and he just up and left and moved into his own apartment. But even after he left, Barbara didn't give up. She sent one of her attorneys to his apartment to ask him to come back to her. Well, that didn't go well at all. Here's how the Spokesman Review said Igor responded. Quote, "Igor pushed the attorney roughly out the door and said, 'You tell my wife I do not want to live with her.'" End quote. Well, that made things pretty clear, right? To you and I maybe, but not to Barbara. She would have her attorneys to arrange one more shot at a reconciliation in the judge's chambers, but that didn't work out either. She was left with no choice but to move on from this man who had made it ever so clear that he did not want her. But like her husbands before him, except Cary Grant, he did want some of her money. Even though she called him the meanest man in the world, he felt entitled to $3 million of her dollars in the form of alimony. This is how that divorce wrapped up for Barbara. The decree was handed down on Halloween Day, October 31st, 1945, by a Judge John Ossie. It was shrouded in so much secrecy that Barbara herself didn't know that her divorce was final until she read about it in a newspaper 3 weeks later. Just having that out of the way was good enough, but the icing on the cake was that Barbara learned that she would not have to pay Prince Igor any money. His request for alimony was denied. Not only did the judge deny his request for her millions, he also made him pay his own court fees. Nice try, Igor. I can only imagine how disappointed he was to walk away empty-handed from what he thought would have been a slam dunk case for him, knowing how her previous husbands had been paid off. Barbara had a lot to be happy about. She got the divorce, she didn't have to pay, and now she could move on to her next romance. This time, she said that she would move cautiously. You see how much runtime is left in this video, so you know that she didn't do that. But here's what was printed in the spokesman review about her next move. Quote, "Now that she's free of Lithuanian Prince Igor Troubetzkoy, Miss Hutton conceded that she has a new romantic interest, but only a romance of friendship. I'm not going to risk it by getting married," she said. End quote. Well, she kept those words for a little while, meaning she didn't marry the romantic friend right away. We'll come back to him. Her next husband was Porfirio Rubirosa. He didn't have an official title like prince or baron or count, but he had an unofficial title, and it was Latin lover. He was an international playboy. This man had sexual affairs with Marilyn Monroe, Eartha Kitt, Ava Gardner, Dorothy Dandridge, Judy Garland, and that doesn't even cover half of his long list of lovers. They might have also called him the Meat Man, because the word around town was that he was packing, and I don't mean suitcases. I mean he had a large penis, so worthy of discussion that, you know, the big pepper mills that they use at restaurants? Well, in fine dining establishments, they started calling them Rubirosas. Now, that was them being disgusting, not me. I'm just reporting to you. But the scandal where our Barbara is concerned has everything to do with who he was married to before her and who else he was having sex with while he was married to her. Porfirio was a Dominican diplomat and a race car driver who got married a total of 5 times in his life. His third wife was Doris Duke. She was an American heiress who came out, as in had her debutante ball, the same year as Barbara. They had actually been friends. They were always mentioned in the news together. The year of their society debuts, Barbara was the second richest debutante. The richest girl of the season was Doris. But all of the papers said that Barbara was the prettiest girl of the season. So you can see how early in their lives, the press started brewing a scenario that would have made competition for these two ladies almost inevitable. But it was up to them, Barbara and Doris, to play into it or not. And I have to say that it looks like Barbara decided to play their dirty game. This is where I think she went wrong. Now, I believe in girl code, and when we are friends with someone, we don't get involved with their exes. Do you play by this code? Let me know in the comments section, because Barbara did not play by this code. Doris was married to Porfirio for a little over a year, from 1947 till 1948. That would have been while Barbara was married to Prince Igor. But as soon as she was single at the same time as Porfirio, she made a move on him, and he went for it. And at this time in Barbara's life, I feel like her heart just went dark, and she wasn't really thinking about anyone except for herself. And maybe a string of horrible marriages will do that to someone, but I really don't like how she handled Doris. On their wedding day, after Barbara said I do to Porfirio, she broke her ankle, leaving her confined to their honeymoon suite. And Porfirio, so excited about his new marriage, went out on the town to celebrate by himself. Well, what Barbara didn't see coming, but frankly she should have seen it coming, was that Porfirio was going to cheat on her, and he did it very publicly with a very public figure. Have you ever heard of Zsa Zsa Gabor? She was a very famous actress who was Porfirio's girlfriend while Barbara was his wife, which wasn't a long time, by the way. Their marriage only lasted for 53 days. Barbara did have to pay him alimony, and I can't feel sorry for her on this one, because when he divorced her friend, Doris, she saw what Doris had to give him in their divorce settlement, and it was a lot. A fishing fleet, a B-25 bomber, which is strange to me, a chateau in Paris, a whole bunch of sports cars, and $25,000 per year until he remarried, which ended up being a total of $125,000 because Doris got to stop making those payments in 1953. That's when backstabbing Barbara made him her problem. So I'm sure that Doris thanked her for being a gal pal and putting an end to those payments for her. Barbara and Doris went on to feud publicly for years. That entire situation is a hot mess scandal for another day. Let me know if you want to hear that story. But where Porfirio was concerned, Barbara should have felt like a fool. After being cheated on in such a public manner, she would lose her man and some more of her fortune. Porfirio would receive from Barbara another B-25 bomber. Why anyone would need one of those, let alone two, I don't know. He also got some expensive jewelry, some polo ponies, a coffee plantation in the Dominican Republic, and $2.5 million. Barbara had the use of this man's phallus for less than 2 months, and she had to share it. Doris had it for a year, and paid a lot less to get rid of him. She definitely got more bang for her buck, pun intended. But even with this major loss, Barbara still wasn't done getting married. Remember that romantic friend who she was talking about while she was waiting on her divorce from Prince Igor? The one who she said she didn't want to risk losing her romantic friendship by getting married? Well, he became her husband number 6. Baron Gottfried von Cramm was his name. Voila, she was a baroness again. He was a German-born baron and tennis star. She had known him for 18 years, and during that time when she was waiting for the divorce from Prince Igor, she went to visit Gottfried and his family on her birthday. Nothing came of their relationship at that time, but here they were, a few years later, and things had changed. After a very short courtship, the pair got married in 1955, and they were separated almost as soon as they said I do. There are at least a couple of reasons why this marriage was doomed from the start. One, by this time, Barbara had a lot of issues she'd been dealing with. She'd been anorexic for most of her adult life, from the time that her first husband told her that she was too fat to sleep with on their wedding night. In addition to being anorexic, she also had substance abuse problems and she suffered from depression. And Gottfried married her to help her get through those challenges. The problem with that was that she didn't really want any help, or she just wasn't ready. Number 2, the other reason that this marriage would never last was that Baron Gottfried was gay. He had spent time in prison for one of his same-sex relationships in the 1930s. So it probably came as a surprise to no one that Barbara started stepping out with other men while she was separated but still married to Gottfried. Remember that I told you that Cary Grant was Barbara's only husband, who reportedly did not request alimony? Well, Baron Gottfried might have been the second one. He really just seemed to want to help a friend whose life was spinning out of control, and I never came across what he asked for in a divorce settlement. I'm not saying that he didn't ask for money. I'm just saying that I never came across evidence of that, and I'm only presenting to you what my research shows. I admit that I could have missed it, but I did not see it. Marriage to her 7th husband gave her the privilege of calling herself princess one last time. Her final husband was the Laotian Prince Pierre Raymond Doan. He had been adopted into a royal family. His work wasn't particularly fascinating. He was a writer and a painter. The prince was also 5 years younger than Barbara. When they met, she was 52 and he was 47. But by this stage in her life, she looked older than her 52 years. And just by appearances, it looked like there was a bigger age gap than the 5 years between them. Barbara met the prince while she was living in Tangier, where she had bought a palatial home for herself. They got married in 1964 in a small Mexican village. And yes, he married her for her money. She spent a lot of money on expensive presents for Prince Pierre and showed up with him on her arm at social functions. That seemed to be all that there was to their relationship. Barbara threw a birthday party for herself in 1966, and Prince Pierre was her date. And right after that party, there was a lot of talk about how divorce was on the horizon for this couple. Now, this is something that is strange to me, because everywhere I looked in just doing a simple search said that this couple got divorced in 1966. Since her birthday is so near the end of the year, November 14th, I started searching 1967 records to find out details on the divorce and how much she had to pay him in alimony. Well, let me tell you, I searched the entire year of 1967 and nothing shows that they were divorced. The whole year they were showing up to parties, doctor's appointments, and her surgeries together. Her health was declining rather rapidly, and the prince was always there, in and out of those hospitals with her. He was still being called her husband, not her ex-husband. And the same could be said for the years 1968 and 1969. Honestly, I didn't see any sign that they got divorced until 1971, and even then it was just mentioned as a small part of a bigger story about the prince. So, I'm saying all of that to say that I don't know when they officially divorced, but I did see a quote from him that said, "She gave me more than $4 million. She gave me love." The prince was quite lucky to get that love gift of $4 million, because by this time her fortune had dwindled down significantly, and it's not hard to figure out why. There was her own lavish spending on properties, jewels, cars, and vacations, plus all the divorce settlements she had paid over the past 30 years. And I have to tell you this, because I'm confident in my research and I have an entire year's worth of news articles showing that Barbara and the prince were married for the whole year of 1967. I can also say that he was openly cheating on Barbara, which we know was nothing new to her. In March of 1967, he was publicly dating a German actress named Vera de Winter. He had met her on a golf course in Spain just before Barbara's birthday party in 1966. At some point, Barbara did divorce him, and years later, when she looked back on their relationship, she said that Prince Pierre was just the same as the others and was only there for her money. The romantic love was never in the cards for her. She did have one person who loved her, her son, Lance, and she loved him so much. Despite growing up, seeing his mother in so many crazy relationships and not having much of a relationship with his own father, Lance had turned out to be a really great man, just a good guy. Lance was the child Barbara had with her second husband, Count Kurt. He was her only child, and that was by her design because she became so obsessed with being thin that she never wanted to gain baby weight again. Lance was profiled in the Press and Sun Bulletin in 1958 when he was 22, and most of what was written about him made him out to be a really kind and level-headed person. Here's just some of what was detailed about him. He was tall and good-looking. He had access to millions of dollars. He owned an airplane and several luxury cars, including a Rolls-Royce and a Ferrari, and he had his own chef and butler, and of course he had a mansion in Beverly Hills. But his mansion only cost $200,000, which was a lot less than he could afford. But that kind of summed up who he was, someone who had it all, but didn't need to spend it all, or show off all of it. Very much the opposite of his mother. Lance seemed to approach everything in a sensible, level-headed manner. He knew the importance of work, and he liked working. He made his hobby his job. Lance loved racing cars, and he learned how to build them in order to sell them. That was his operation. Lance was also keenly aware of the fact that he was envied for his money. At the time of this interview, he was engaged to the up-and-coming Hollywood actress, Jill St. John. She noticed the envy regarding his money too, chiming in to tell the reporter that when Lance wins a race, the sentiment from most people was like, "Of course he won, I'd win too if I could afford a car like that." And when he lost, people would just call him a lazy bum, too rich to care about practicing and excelling at his sport. He said that he had a wary eye for young women who were willing to marry him. He didn't trust everyone's intentions. His own words, quote, "How do you know whether they're interested in you as a human being or your money? That's the trouble with being born rich. It's both a curse and a convenience," end quote. If only his mother had a better handle on that question. Lance deeply loved his mother, but he saw her as someone who completely lacked the ability to be a good judge of character. At this point, she thought that all of her ex-husbands might have still been good men, while Lance said that he could see through all of them, his own father included, who, at the time of this article, Lance hadn't spoken to in 10 years. He said that his mother never hurt anyone except for herself. We know that wasn't true because she certainly did hurt Doris Duke after she married the lady's ex-husband, but that was just Lance looking at his mother through the eyes of a child. Other than that, he was spot on about his assessments of his mother. But he could only concern himself with his own actions, and he was determined to be better, and he was. Not only did he like race car driving, he was really good at it and won a lot of races. He won the International Grand Prix and the Governor's Cup in 1958. He was well respected by his fellow drivers, who would remark on how good he was, but more importantly, how safe he was. They said that he never took stupid risks on the track and didn't mind pulling back from the lead if it meant that at the end of the race, everyone could go home alive. He was really just an all-around good kid who happened to be rich. For whatever she had messed up before, Barbara got one thing right for sure. Her Lance. She reared a very rich boy who had all of the right qualities: compassion, intelligence, self-awareness, a good sense of humor, and a desire to be a genuinely good person. His money didn't corrupt him. He saw it as just another thing that he had. And he would have a lot more of it after his mother died, as was written in the Press and Sun Bulletin, quote, "Upon her death, Lance will inherit all her holdings," end quote. In the natural order of things, this is the way that it would go. But her precious Lance would never inherit his millions, for he would die 7 years before she did in an horrific plane crash on July 24th, 1972. And no one could have seen it coming. If anyone would have had to make a guess on such a morbid matter as his death, they would have guessed that a car crash would have taken him out. He did end up marrying Jill St. John, and they divorced because of his car racing. When the whole story was pieced together, it came out that for some reason, a young, unlicensed pilot was flying Lance and his friends around Aspen, Colorado. Their destination wasn't exactly clear. The emphasis that Lance had always put on safety in his sport made the news all the more ironic to his loved ones. They were all shocked and hurt, but probably no one more than his mother. At this stage, she was done with all of her husbands and would never marry again. Her physical and mental health were fading quickly. On the rare occasions that she was well enough to be in public, she was usually belligerently drunk. She was making headlines for being in and out of hospitals for various surgeries and treatments. Her fortune had dwindled down to practically nothing. In a kind of ticker tape style, her weight was reported as 98 pounds. She was so frail that she had to be carried around like luggage. She'd lived her entire adult life, spending excessively and looking for men to love her in an effort to cure her pain. But after Lance died, there was no point in even trying. His death was what finally broke her spirit. She became a recluse and moved into a hotel suite. Her finances were in such a shamble that she had to start selling many of her expensive items just so she could pay her bills. Woolworth was the name that made Barbara famous and one of the richest women in the world. By Woolworth's 100th anniversary in 1979, it had become the largest department store chain in the world. It was a great year for the company that was memorialized in the Guinness Book of World Records. That was also the year that Barbara died. On May 11th, 1979, she died, alone in her penthouse suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. The official cause? A heart attack brought on by anorexia nervosa. Just weeks before her death, at her final doctor's appointment, she weighed in at a frightening 82 pounds. And her funeral was as sad of an event as you can probably imagine. The Daily News described the day as dark and with rain-swollen clouds filling the sky. It took place at the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Her remains were laid to rest in the Woolworth Mausoleum on top of her son's. And only 10 people showed up to her burial. 10. I hope that one of those attendees was Philip Van Rensselaer, because he certainly did not waste any time writing a tell-all memoir about her after she died. His book was called $1 Million Baby, and it was on the shelves just months after Barbara passed away. He had only been her friend up until her late 50s, but she died at the age of 66. I'm not saying that he didn't attend her funeral, but I didn't see his name listed among the attendees. And that being said, I wasn't able to find a full list, so I'll have to give him the benefit of the doubt. But it still looks tacky that someone who was not a friend till the end was so quick to capitalize on her death. The thought of being super rich seems like a lot of fun to a lot of people, and yeah, I get it, probably most of us want a little extra money. But there is a dark side to being very rich. Too many people only see you for the money you have. Here are a couple of newspaper quotes that might help us to understand Barbara a little better. This one is from Barbara herself. She said, "I won't say my husbands thought only of my money, but it had a certain fascination for them." End quote. And this one is a question from a reader and an answer from a columnist. LP from St. Louis asked, "What makes a woman like Barbara Hutton, who's always had everything, act the way she does? This is her 7th divorce, if rumors are true, for heaven's sake." And I thought that the response from the columnist was insightful. The reply was, "Has Miss Hutton had everything? At 4, she saw her mother die. At 7, her grandfather. And at 12, her grandmother. Her first parties consisted of a group composed of an insensitive grandfather, his nurse, her grandmother, who had by then lost her mind, and her grandmother's keeper. My father was young and very busy," she has said. "He loved me, of course, but I was only an ordinary, rather stupid little girl, and I couldn't be a real companion to a gay, brilliant man, could I?" Of her mother, she has spoken in even more revealing terms. "I hardly remember her," she says, "but I have missed her all my life." End quote. At the end of the day, Barbara was just a very rich woman who was looking for someone to love her. So while her extravagant spending was over the top and not so wise, if we look at it through her lens, those spending sprees were among the few occasions in which people were nice to her. When she was spending money and they were earning huge commissions, they would flash a smile her way that seemed genuine. You can be sure that she got more from shopping than just the items she was purchasing. This was a woman who paid for her friends to be around her, and she knew that they were there for her money because if she didn't pay up, they didn't show up. And her poorly attended funeral proves that. Barbara Woolworth Hutton inherited $42 million in 1930 and died with $3,500 in 1979. Now, maybe we see how it all happened.
Next, J.J. Astor VI.
Previously on Ty's Hot Mess History.
Enzo was never really into Madeline, and he wasn't too fond of her firstborn son either, calling the younger John Jacob a poor little rich boy. Though Madeline didn't leave her first son any money, she did leave him 2 pieces of her jewelry, a pearl necklace that was valued at just over $1,500 and a diamond solitaire ring that was worth over $50,000. I'd like to think that those pieces had sentimental value. She was almost always photographed wearing a 2-strand pearl necklace. Perhaps the ring was the one that John Jacob used to propose to her. That would have been touching if those were the 2 pieces that she was able to leave to her son. He was the baby who Madeline was carrying on the Titanic, who she named after his father. He was also John Jacob Astor, but he was also known as the Titanic baby. And even though he was born into wealth, he had a lot of troubles of his own. If you want to know the story of that little brat, who was once labeled in a headline as the rich boy nobody wants, let me know in the comments section.
Well, you let me know, so we are here. I'm finally delivering it. This is a story about a rich boy who grew up to be a rich, miserable man. And if it weren't for his family's money, he'd have had no identity at all. He survived the sinking of the Titanic, in a way. His mother was a few months pregnant, carrying him, when she and her husband were on the Titanic, returning to America from their honeymoon in Egypt and Europe. She was Madeline Astor, the wife of John Jacob Astor IV, the richest passenger on the ship. Their son was John Jacob Astor VI, though he was also called the Titanic baby, and later on in his life, the rich boy nobody wants. He was wealthy and frankly not much else, but he was a flaming hot mess. Let's get into it. John Jacob Astor VI was an American socialite more than anything, and a businessman, arguably to a much lesser degree. He was the 3rd child of his father, John Jacob Astor IV, and the 1st child of his mother, Madeline Force Astor. His father never got to lay eyes on his son because he died a gentleman's death on the Titanic on April 15, 1912, seeing to it that his young, teenage wife made it safely into a lifeboat. He reportedly helped many other women and children get into lifeboats and even went to the ship's kennel to release the dogs on board and gave them a fighting chance. 4 months later, almost exactly 4 months later, on August 14th, the young widow, Madeline Astor, gave birth to her baby boy, who was almost immediately dubbed the Titanic baby, John Jacob Astor VI. He weighed in at almost 8 pounds, a big boy born into big money. I can only imagine that his father thought that he had a second lease on life and was looking forward to returning home from his honeymoon with his new wife and starting the second chapter of his life. But that didn't stop him from having a will in place, in case the worst happened. And the worst did happen. But all was well. The Titanic baby slid out of his mom's uterus right into a $3 million fortune. His trust fund that J.J. Astor IV set up in his will for any spare kids that came along, it was definitely an afterthought and not anything specific like he had for Madeline or his daughter Ava. And the Titanic baby's measly $3 million trust was nothing like what his father had left for his older half-brother, Vincent. Because Vincent was left with almost all of his father's vast fortune of $85 million. All of their father's luxury mansions and hotels, and roughly $70 million went to Vincent. And that became a thorn in the Titanic baby's side as soon as he understood what money was, and it remained a problem for him well into his adult years, even after Vincent died. And speaking of Vincent, he was not present for the birth of his new brother, and his absence seemed to foreshadow what their relationship would become. Distant at best. Everything about young John Jacob was about money, and for the remainder of this video, I'll do my best to call him young John Jacob as a means of differentiating between his father, the fourth. I'll also refer to him as Jakey, which was the nickname that the press seemed to use for him most often. And while I'm on a tangent, this often comes up, so I'll address it concisely right now. If the father is John Jacob Astor IV, why is the son the sixth and not the fifth? Long story short, there was a branch of Astors who made a wonderful living for themselves in England, and John Jacob Astor, the first Baron Astor of Hever, was born before our young John Jacob of today's story, so he was officially the fifth, and the American was the sixth, another thorn in Jakey's side. Now, back to our story. On the day that he was born, Manhattan was in a frenzy. He was America's version of nobility. Manhattan was buzzing as though a new prince had been born. Police officers had to stand guard on the Astor's block and fight off crowds of people who were hoping to catch a glimpse of the newborn baby. But most of the talk about young John Jacob had to do with money. And in one of the very first news articles written about him on the very first day after his birth, there was a lot of discussion about his $3 million trust. Mainly a rumor that his grandparents on his mother's side wanted to contest the will of young John's father, because they didn't think that $3 million was enough for the boy. Mind you, we're talking $3 million in 1912, which today in 2023 has the buying power of about $94 million. Would that be enough for you? If that would not be enough money for you because you have substantially more, email me if you're looking for a girlfriend. Somewhere, a rumor was started that the will would be contested so that the Titanic baby would be given just as much money as his older half-brother, Vincent Astor. The story grew legs when the baby was given his father's full name at birth, the assumption being that his mother deliberately gave him that name to make her case stronger when it came time to contest the will. But according to his maternal grandfather, William Forrest, none of that was true. His words, quote, "The report that there will be a contest of Mr. Astor's will is all nonsense. All these reports of a contest are nonsense," end quote. So, $3 million was all that this poor baby was going to get, and it would have been the same if he'd been born a girl. That was just the amount that his father settled on for any additional children other than Ava, who received $10 million, and Vincent, who inherited the lion's share, $69 million. But only $3 million for his little half-brother, which was nothing special in the Astor family. And the Titanic baby himself would prove to be nothing special as he grew into adulthood. But at this point in his new life, there it was. $3 million was enough for the baby, until it wasn't. Which was around the time that he turned 4 years old. We'll get there. But in the meantime, his mother, Madeline Astor, had made her mourning plans public. The standard for an upper-class widow in this period was to publicly express her mourning through her clothing, and usually for a period of 2 years, in which she would wear black and other very dark-colored dresses and jet-black mourning jewelry, literally made from the mineral called jet. And Madeline did mourn her husband in this way for 2 years, retired from public life inside of the Astor Fifth Avenue mansion with her baby. And even though they weren't doing anything besides staying home, Madeline soon realized that the scheduled monthly withdrawals for the care of the young John Jacob would not be enough to cover his expenses. In November of 1912, Jakey was approaching the age of 3 months. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle had printed yet another article about his finances. This one laid out how his mother, as his financial guardian, would schedule yearly withdrawals for his day-to-day care, and how she planned to help him earn interest on the account so that he would have accrued a lot more additional interest until the trust was eventually turned over to his own care. She requested only $10,000 per year from his trust, saying that that amount would cover his needs. Now, I've never had a child, but that $10,000 in 1912 had the buying power of just over $315,000 today. Would that be enough for one of your children? Madeline only wanted the $10,000 per year for 3 years, after which she would support her son with her own money. Her goal was to allow her son's millions to collect interest so that he would have even more millions by the time that he reached the age of maturity. Specifically, she hoped that her plan would turn his $3 million into about $10 million by the time the boy turned 21. And I think that that's good looking out on her part. But his mother wasn't the only one who was looking out for him. In May of 1913, when the young Astor was only 9 months old, a tidal wave of presents for him landed at his Fifth Avenue mansion. The Titanic baby mania had taken over the world, and people from all over were sending him presents, infant wear, lace-lined bassinets and cribs, and I'm sure that it seemed like a kind, even if a little bit creepy, gesture to most people, except for the one secretary who had the duty of returning to sender each and every single item. I don't have an explanation for why this happened all of a sudden. It wasn't his birthday. The anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic had passed by this time, and I'm almost sure that invariably each of those presents came from people who were not as well off as the Astors, because practically everyone in the world had less money than the Astors. The next time little Jakey was discussed in the news, it was back to the money. This is when the public learned that $10,000 per year was in fact not enough to care for the Titanic baby. Truth be told, his mother had figured that out the second year of his life and had already increased his allowance from $10,000 per year to $20,000 per year, roughly $620,000 in today's money. But he didn't make the papers because the allowance increase had been exposed. He made the news because his mother realized that even $20,000 was not enough money to care for him on an annual basis, and she'd had to dig in her own pockets to loan her baby son $7,590 just so that his expenses for the previous year were in the clear. Now, in all fairness, I have to say that the young John Jacob had a number of expenses that most toddlers didn't have, and they included, but were not limited to, attorneys, a physician and a nurse, estate taxes, income taxes, and mansion maintenance expenses. Altogether, his yearly expenses were just over $27,000, and his mother went to court to request a little extra money from his trust to cover the cost of his care. This wasn't the only noteworthy moment in Jakey's life when he was 4. That same year, his mother married her second husband, the successful and sensible banker Carl Dick. This union gave the young John Jacob 2 younger half-brothers, William Jr. and John. They spent their days traveling from place to place, New York, Florida, Rhode Island, and Europe. From this point on, for most of his childhood, the young John Jacob was kept away from the press. His mother was so occupied with making her new blended family work that she no longer had the time to manage Jakey's trust, so she turned that over to his oldest half-brother, Vincent. During this time in his life, young John Jacob had a tutor who made it known that Jakey was not a bright student, nor, despite having a wealthy upbringing, did he possess any social charm. This tutor was James Noble Gifford, and he made these details about Jakey known in a tell-all book called Caviar for Breakfast, a book that used pseudonyms to talk about its subjects, but everyone knew that it was very clear that he was writing about Jakey. James Gifford had tutored many wealthy students, but several chapters in his book were dedicated to a student named Jack, who he described as the best-known boy in the world. He wrote that the boy had very expensive taste, loved caviar for breakfast, and refused to ride in any car except his own because other vehicles were too common. He also threw in an anecdote about the boy only riding the elevator in his house to get from one level to the next. Even if the elevator was broken, he'd wait for it to be repaired before he took the stairs up or down. Side note about James Noble Gifford: the proximity that he gained to New York's wealthy as a tutor was something that he used against the elite in novel after novel. He wrote a number of books in the 1930s, all exposing the extremely rich for being extremely lazy and lacking morality. And the novels seemed to sell really well. So I made a video about how a lot of wealthy white people who lived during the Gilded Age funded the construction of a lot of buildings at historically black universities. At the end of that video, I mentioned that the name Astor is on a building at the St. George School in Rhode Island, near Newport. At that time, I knew that Vincent Astor had donated money to the school, but I didn't know that Jakey Astor had also attended the school, and boy oh boy was he unpopular. If this school had those fun yearbook categories, he would have been voted least likely to succeed and most likely to be an ass. Even though the things that his former tutor had written about him seemed to be mean, they also seemed to have a ring of truth when compared to what his classmates said about him. By the time Jakey was a teenager, his high society peers would talk behind his back about his extreme arrogance and horrible manners. They said that he was never at the top of his class and went about his schooling as though he didn't care about it. And he didn't. It wasn't like he needed a good education so that he could get a good job. He was born into more money than he'd ever need. So he put little effort into his expensive education, so little that he didn't even finish that school. He wasn't really interested in getting into college or pursuing a career. His interests were cars and movies. School was just a place for him to brag about being the only living John Jacob Astor, and he would do that, literally, even though it wasn't true that he was the only living John Jacob Astor. The fifth had been born before him, 26 years before him, and was living as a true gentleman with a title and everything in England. And while Jakey was bragging about being the only living John Jacob Astor, J.J. Astor V was alive and well on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean and didn't die until 1971. Now, there was some point when Jakey was a teenager that he had another major life change. Madeline, his mother, had pretty much given up on him after she said that he had a governess who had turned him against everyone and everything. And during these years, before he reached the age of majority, it seems like maybe from the time of 16 or so, he lived on his own, without any parents or guardians, at an apartment in the Savoy Plaza. In 1932, when young Jacob was 20, he tried his hand at love. He was on a vacation in Italy where he met a young woman his same age. Her name was Donna Christina Torlonia. She was reported to be a beauty, a statuesque blonde with blue eyes. They saw each other often and were seen out and about and having fun for his whole trip. Then suddenly it was announced that they were engaged to be married. Apparently Jakey and Donna had not only gotten engaged, but they started planning their wedding because the news got leaked by a friend of Donna's who said that she was going to be a bridesmaid. Now, this was 1932, a time when people generally did not enter into marriage as lightly as many do today, and people as young as Jakey and Donna from wealthy families certainly would have had many discussions before planning what would have been a big society wedding. He just proposed without asking her parents, and there was no chance in hell that that was going to work, even if he was an Astor. Donna's mother told the papers that the whole idea was absurd, and Jakey, who thought that his name and money meant everything in the world, was left in disbelief, not understanding why the Torlonias wouldn't jump at the chance to welcome him as their son-in-law. Well, believe it or not, that would not be the last time that young John Jacob would try to marry a girl without her parents' permission and get rejected. He also tried unsuccessfully to rush a Susie Hopkins and a LeBrun Kruger Rhinelander down the aisle with him. But on his 21st birthday, he was officially a man, and he received his trust money. The $3 million had grown to at least $5 million, about $118 million today, and he could do whatever he wanted to do with it, but it was likely closer to $10 million. The true amount was never disclosed to the press. Now he finally possessed the money that was the only thing that had ever made him newsworthy. Being a rich baby turned rich kid and now rich young adult seemed to be his only identity. Nobody ever said that he was smart or cute or charming or kind. Well, there was Big. He was called Big in his birth announcements, but other than that, he was just the rich Titanic kid who also had a reputation for being a snob. And now he was the rich Titanic adult, able to make of his life whatever he wanted. And even he went on continuing to make his money his identity. One of his first purchases was a yellow Rolls-Royce that seemed to be his favorite car. It wouldn't take long before he'd have an entire fleet of about 10 luxury automobiles. His mother's third husband said Jakey would drive each one every day, as if they were horses that needed to be exercised for a while. Jakey also used a private railroad car to get to longer distances, though sometimes he was known to hire a private railroad car to take himself and his friends just on short distance trips that anyone else would have just taken by car. If there was a way that he could spend $1,000 instead of $100, he'd choose the $1,000 route every single time. In addition to getting his hands on his money, another big change came for Jakey when he turned 21. His mother divorced her second husband, which was the only father Jakey had ever known. She ditched him for Italian boxer Enzo Fioramonte, who was only a few years older than Jakey. And the young John Jacob didn't like this match at all, and he was very vocal about it. I have told that couple's story on this channel, and I have to say, I agree with Jakey 100% on this one. Enzo and his mother were not a good match. I won't go into all of the details here, but I'll say this. She was emotionally and financially abusive to him, and he was physically abusive to her. Now, as I was saying, Jakey didn't like this relationship with his mother and the boxer, and I completely understand why. But perhaps he could have navigated that situation more smoothly if he hadn't made his opinion known through snarky quotes to newspaper writers. He had to have known that that would embarrass his mother. The boxer, by the way, was the one who had made the comment about all of Jakey's luxury cars, saying that they were a bit overboard and basically suggesting that Jakey's obsession with them was unnatural. That's true, but that also could have come from a place of jealousy because the boxer himself had no problem at all spending his wife's money on expensive items for himself. But that was Madeline's problem. That was her wedding. The young John Jacob would soon be making his own wedding plans. At the age of 21, he was officially available for marriage, and his fortune made him one of the most eligible bachelors in the world. But even with his massive fortune, and being a member of one of the most distinguished families in the country, the mothers and fathers of his society group were eager to pass on the chance of becoming his in-law and subjecting their debutantes to marriage with him. In 1934, he found a girl who was willing to take the challenge when New York socialite Eileen Gillespie said yes to his marriage proposal. The pair had been dating for a while and things seemed to be going well. They were planning a grand wedding. Everything was set, even the date, February 6, 1934. Then, Jakey started being Jakey. According to relatives of both families, Jakey was rude and sarcastic to Eileen's parents. Also, they were rather conservative and didn't approve of Jakey's flashy lifestyle and wild spending. Even though he was a grown man, he was said to have conducted himself like a petulant child. The Gillespies didn't approve of his, quote, fits of temperament, fickleness, jealousy, or his unstable and extravagant tastes, end quote. Then there was also the reported argument over the amount of Eileen's dowry. It seems that after the families had settled on an amount, Jakey wanted more. Eileen's parents had had enough. They tried to convince their daughter to move on from the Titanic baby. Here's a quote that Mrs. Gillespie gave to the Daily News in February of 1934. Quote, although her views and mine have been divided, at the present time we are absolutely in accord. I'm glad that I was able to open my daughter's eyes in time, end quote. And with that, the Lawrence Lewis Gillespies officially called off the wedding on January 22nd, just 2 weeks before their daughter was supposed to walk down the aisle. This cancellation surprised no one in high society except Jakey. He was so proud of his family name and fortune that it was inconceivable to him that debutantes weren't lining up at the chance to become the next Mrs. Astor by marriage to him. In the story about Jakey the Daily News called The Rich Boy Nobody Wants, this was what they printed about young John Jacob's love for his money and family name. Quote, just how much money Jack has is probably known only to Jack, his closest relatives, bankers, and lawyers. But just how much family he has is known by a great many people in the world. And just how orally proud he is of that fortune and name is known by practically everyone in his social sphere. End quote. The people around Jakey were fed up with his bragging. All of the things that he bragged about having, they had. They were in his social circle, and they were all there for the same reason, mainly that they all had ridiculous amounts of wealth. But Jakey thought that somehow his money made him more special. Perhaps it was this love of money and the status that he thought it gave him that made the young John Jacob resent his older brother, Vincent Astor, so much. And don't get it wrong, Vincent was no fan of Jakey. But while Jakey was bragging about having money, Vincent was busy making money for himself and his entire family. He kept to himself. Vincent married more than once, and neither he nor his wives enjoyed being in the public eye. He was a private person who liked to do good for his family and his city, out of the spotlight. He took his role as head of the Astor family and fortune very seriously. So when Jakey's mother asked him to take charge of Jakey's finances, he did. and he took that seriously too. Vincent seemed to put family ahead of everything. He was never a fan of Jakey's mother. Recall that when John Jacob Astor IV married her, she was only 18 and so was Vincent. But Vincent loved his father, so he accepted his father's wife. And while many reports say that Jakey's $3 million fortune grew to $5 million under Vincent's charge, several reports, like this one in the Daily News, say that Vincent actually increased his little brother's trust to somewhere around $10 million. But whether it was actually 5 or 10 million, it wasn't enough for John Jacob, and he wanted half of the money that was left to Vincent. The family knew how bitter he was, but the public and his elite social circle only saw the side of him that was constantly showing off, bragging, and spending like crazy. Because he never developed a personality, his hope was that material things would attract women to him. So, in an effort to prove himself as husband-worthy material for Eileen Gillespie, he purchased, quote, a colossal townhouse and an equally huge Newport place for the girl he hoped to make his bride, end quote. In the late 1800s, Newport, Rhode Island became the place where wealthy New Yorkers bought summer homes. That's why he purchased a place there too. But again, the huge homes would not be enough for the Gillespies to turn their daughter over into young Jacob's hands. Quick side note regarding the passing down of fortunes in the Astor family. This is one of the reasons that I love sharing these old news articles with you, because they give us a pretty unfiltered look at how people thought and talked back then, long before the days of political correctness, and I like that. So, the first John Jacob Astor had several daughters and 2 sons. They were John Jacob II and William Backhouse Astor. When the father died, he had a $20 million fortune, and he left most of it to William. John Jacob II was left only $10,000 because he was an idiot. Now, when they used the word idiot during his lifetime, they meant someone who had an intellectual disability. But I think that it's a little ironic that 3 generations later, the world sees another John Jacob give most of his money to the son who was not an idiot. And I mean idiot the way that we use that term today, like a fool or a moron. Anyway, this is how that long news story called The Rich Boy Nobody Wants ended. First, with a quote from a friend of the Gillespies, Mrs. Bruce Metcalf, and she was diplomatic about it. This is how the entire ending reads, quote, and Mrs. Bruce Metcalf, a friend of the Gillespies, is quoted as saying, I think the whole thing was a blessing. The young couple were not mated. They would never have been happy. How splendid that they found out in time. Now that's the end of her quote. Then it goes on to read, and the 5th John Jacob Astor is still the boy nobody wants. End quote. Now eventually, the young John Jacob did get married. And when somebody finally did want the boy, it was a bit of a scandal because she was a very close friend of Eileen Gillespie, his ex-fiancée. He settled on a girl named Ellen Tucky French. And this little hussy was so close to Eileen that she was going to be a bridesmaid in her wedding. Well, guess what? She had been attracted to little Jakey the whole time that Eileen was dating him. When he proposed to Eileen. When he was making wedding plans with Eileen. When he bought not 1, but 2 humongous houses for Eileen to share with her in holy matrimony. This friend stood by Eileen and helped her pick out wedding colors and wedding reception food and a wedding cake. She probably went with her to try on dresses and told Eileen that all the ugly dresses were actually pretty. But here's the thing. Jakey's heart was still with Eileen. Nobody even thought that that little rascal had a heart, but he was heartbroken over losing Eileen. He left the country and went to Shanghai to grieve the relationship. Even months later, he said that he would still be willing to marry her. Now, we all know that he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. He still didn't really seem to understand that he was the one who had been dumped, so it didn't matter that he was still willing to marry her, but nevertheless, weeks after returning to New York, he proposed to Ellen French. Of course, she said yes, old nasty hussy, and you can't tell me that nasty Jakey got with Ellen for any other reason but to try to get under Eileen's skin. He would have married one of her friends regardless, because he was just that spiteful. But tell me this, do you think that part of Ellen's appeal to him was that her name was so close to Eileen? So, if he were to call out the wrong name in the throes of passion, he could just try to cover it up. But I must admit, this guy doesn't exactly give me the throes of passion, fun in the sack vibes. He seemed like he would want to hurry up and rush his time in bed so that he could go spend time with his one true love, his money. Anyway, Jakey and Ellen got married on June 30th, 1934. And don't they look happy? They had one child, a boy named William Backhouse Astor III. And I'm surprised that the Astors didn't retire the name Backhouse. So you know that Jakey and Vincent Astor are the grandchildren of Caroline Astor, the Gilded Age queen of high society. Well, she made her husband refer to himself as William B. Astor because she thought that Backhouse sounded too much like outhouse. So that was just a thought in my head. Young John Jacob went on to get married a total of 4 times in his life. And believe it or not, it wouldn't be the women in his life that proved to be the bane of his existence. Because you know how horrible wives can be, right, fellas? Ha ha ha. Just kidding, ladies. His biggest problem seemed to be wills that left him with scrawny inheritances. Not getting enough money when his closest family members passed away. First, there was his dad, who had the nerve to only leave him a measly $3 million after dying on the Titanic. Then, when his mother passed away, with about $1.5 million to her name, that money went to his younger half-brothers that she had with her second husband. His mom, at that point, figured that Jakey should have been good for money for the rest of his life. So all that she left him was a diamond solitaire ring and a 2-strand pearl necklace that wasn't worth a lot. I mean, if he were to have pawned that necklace, he wouldn't even have had enough money to buy one Rolls Royce. Sheesh. But then there was Vincent, his big brother. Jakey never let it go that Vincent got practically all of their father's money after he died. And even after Vincent died, he still pursued that $70 million that their father left to Vincent. And he got downright nasty about it. Now again, Vincent never liked young John Jacob. All that he did for him was because he was dutiful to his family. Vincent loved his father so much that he honored his father's wife. But truth be told, he never liked Madeline. He never respected Madeline, and therefore, when she gave birth to Jakey, Vincent didn't even believe that Jakey was a biological Astor, and he did not recognize him as such. But he still performed his duty as guardian over his brother's trust and grew the money. Jakey would never have as much money as Vincent, but Vincent saw to it that Jakey was set for life. And how did Jakey repay his brother? By suing Vincent's wife after Vincent died and trying to smear his brother's name posthumously. Here's the story. Vincent's health was failing him badly in 1958. He was hospitalized for a good part of that year. His wife, Brooke, would sometimes bring him alcohol to help him deal with his pain. The alcohol didn't do much except provide him temporary pain relief, for his death was right around the corner. Vincent Astor passed away on February 3rd, 1959, at the age of 67. He died of a heart attack. But months before he passed, in June of 1958, he revised and signed a new will that left Jakey absolutely nothing. By this time, Vincent had grown his fortune to $120 million, and he left half of it to his wife for her living expenses so that she could maintain the luxurious lifestyle she had when Vincent was alive. The other half went to the charitable foundation that the couple managed, the Vincent Astor Foundation. And Jakey, never having been too smart in math, said, "Okay, his wife got half, his charity got half, now where's my half?" Okay, he didn't really say that, but he did come looking for the money that he always thought was his. Brooke hadn't even been able to get out of her mourning clothes before she found out that she was being sued by her dead husband's brother. That was bad enough, but what the young John Jacob told the press was even worse. Vincent Astor had always maintained a stellar reputation. Everyone saw him as an upright man. He was admired in high society circles, but he was the first Astor who was admired outside of those circles because he had a heart for the people in his city. He was the first Astor to take on philanthropic causes in any major way, and people remembered him that way. But Jakey told the press that his brother had left him out of his will because he was mentally ill, a senile alcoholic whose wife had been feeding him so much booze that when the time came for him to make his will, he was too insane to know what he was doing. He was trying to do to Vincent in death what he never could have done to him in life, attempt to ruin his image. Now, when Vincent's name appeared in the press, it was alongside words like mentally incompetent and deranged. Come on now, Jakey. Well before your brother got sick and was in his fully right state of mind, we all know that he was never a fan of yours and that the whole world would have expected Vincent to not acknowledge Jakey in his will. Brooke made it abundantly clear that Vincent was of sound mind and knew exactly what he was doing when he made his final will. And nobody was on Jakey's side, not even the press. Newsday hit him with a fat joke, writing, quote, "Vincent Astor, who died last February 3rd at the age of 67, left a fortune of between $100 million and $200 million, but not a cent of it to his portly younger half-brother." End quote. This portly prick was now 47 years old, jealous of his dead brother and still wanting money that never belonged to him. Instead of joining his sister-in-law to share in the grieving process, he'd made himself a burden on this heartbroken woman. But that was Jakey, always putting himself first and his love of money as a very close second. He whined that Vincent had a legal right, but not a moral right to keep all of the money. Well, once again, showing that he was not too bright, as he was suing in a court of law, not a court of morals. He accused Brooke of giving his brother alcohol to influence him to leave him out of the will. But anyone who knew even half of the story knew that on a sober day, Vincent would have made the same decision. He didn't need anything to influence him to tell his little brother to take a hike. Thankfully, the court did not agree with Jakey. Brooke Astor settled and gave her sorry-ass brother-in-law $250,000, probably just enough to really piss him off, and that was that. And she went on to give away those millions of dollars to charity and did so much good in the world because of it, just like she and her husband had always done. What a waste it would have been to have given that kind of money to a selfish person like Jakey. The Titanic baby died in Miami Beach in 1992. He was 79 years old. He was survived by his younger brother from his mom's second marriage, his daughter, son, and 3 grandchildren. One of them, Gregory Todd Astor, played Colonel Astor in Titanic the musical in 2012, 100 years after the Titanic sank. Jakey's death was not remarked upon in any grand way, but that was probably the fairest reflection upon his life. He was not grand. He hadn't done anything but been born into wealth. Just months before Jakey died, his daughter, Jackie Astor, made a statement that might have humanized Jakey in some people's eyes. She said, quote, "It was all so sad and tragic for his mother and the whole family. You know, his parents were very much in love, and I think the memory of it all has affected his whole life. Why can't people just forget the Titanic?" End quote. Why can't we forget the Titanic? I know that for me, the answer is that ultimately, Titanic is a story about lives way more than the ship itself. I think of all of those people, and even their pets, being excited, nervous, looking forward to their next adventure, that so many of them never got to see. I don't think that Titanic will ever be forgotten. So many people remember it for so many different reasons.
And lastly, Doris Duke.
Why? An 80-year-old woman would want a facelift. It's beyond me. For what? So she can look 70? Now there's an improvement. Women.
In God's eyes, all children are beautiful, but here on earth, we have higher standards. That is a quote from Stephen Colbert. I admit that it's not the nicest saying I've ever heard. But when it comes to today's subject, Doris Duke, it seems that a lot of men in her day would have applied this phrase to her. She was always remarked upon for her extreme wealth, and often remarked upon for never being the prettiest girl in the room. Well, without the help of plastic surgery and extreme procedures, we can't really change how our faces look, so maybe it's not fair to judge one for being ugly on the outside. But what about being ugly on the inside? Is that off limits? I don't think so, and by the time that I get to the end of this story, you might feel the same as I do if you don't already. You decide for yourself as we get into the life of Doris Duke. When she was born, the press called her the $1 million baby. Her father was one of the richest tobacco men in the world. She grew up with all of the trappings of extreme wealth, with luxuries most people could only imagine. Many might have thought that because of her daddy's fortune, that her life was perfect. Well, if it was, we wouldn't be talking about it on this channel. How boring. But today's subject, Doris Duke, heiress to the Duke family fortune. She had a full bank account, but a rather empty life because she couldn't trust many of the people in it. Here she was, this woman who, because of her great fortune, was in full control of her life. So how did she ever get to the point that a servant took control of her? Her butler, of all people. What's a girl to do when she's got a lot of dollars, but only a few friends? Most of the time, she'll do whatever she wants, with little consequence to pay, even if it's killing a man, which she did. But that one action doesn't sum up her entire life. And what a fascinating life it was. This is the story of a woman who had money coming out of the wazoo, 2 gold-digging husbands, a violent sugar baby boyfriend, and a homicide that she got away with, at least according to one detailed investigation. Fascinating, but a hot mess. Just the way we like it. Let's get into it. On November 22nd, 1912, Doris was born to parents Nana Lean and James Duke. Her mother, Nanaline, was a widow from Atlanta, Georgia. Doris's father was her second husband. She was a typical Gilded Age wife who helped her husband navigate through society life in ways that would benefit him and his business. She spent a lot of money furnishing the family's home in New York and their summer home in Newport, Rhode Island. By the time she was done, she had a real art collection full of museum-worthy pieces. Doris's father was James Duke, a millionaire tobacco baron. He had also been married before, but he divorced his first wife after a brief marriage. James made his money farming tobacco and mass-producing cigarettes. By the 1880s, while in his late 20s, he was furnishing half the country's total production of cigarettes. Alongside his brother, Benjamin, James co-founded the Southern Power Company, which still exists today in North Carolina as Duke Energy. And it was within the service area of the energy company that James Duke focused his philanthropic efforts, which were very specific in regards to which people and institutions would receive monetary donations. Most people who know anything at all about the Duke family know that Duke University was named after Doris's family, mainly because of her grandfather, Washington Duke, who had poured a lot of money into a Quaker and Methodist-related institution called Trinity College. Washington Duke helped the school to relocate from Randolph County to Durham, North Carolina in 1892. The president of Trinity College insisted on rechartering the school as Duke University in honor of Washington Duke and the entire Duke family. But the university was only one of many places that received funds from the Dukes. The Duke brothers had been reared as Methodists and practiced financial stewardship in the manner that they learned from their religious faith. James made it his business to give to people who were impoverished and overlooked. And in 1924, he established the Duke Endowment, a trust he would use to provide financial help to those in need in the Carolinas. He sent his money to nonprofit hospitals and orphanages for Black children and white children. This was the 1920s, and the orphanages definitely would have been segregated. His money also went to small Methodist churches, retired Methodist preachers, and 3 universities: Furman University in South Carolina and Johnson C. Smith University and Davidson College, both in North Carolina. It might seem odd that his Christian faith was so important to him, yet he sold cigarettes, which most people associate more with sin or as being a vice. And in the time of James Duke, the only women who smoked cigarettes were women of ill repute. Smoking wasn't looked down on as badly for men. Nevertheless, tobacco was just the family business. They say that if you want to know what a man values, you can look at where his money goes. It seems pretty clear that James valued his Methodist faith and North and South Carolina, the states where his family made their generational wealth. His next generation was the only child he and Nanaline had together, Doris. From the day that Doris Duke was born, she was famous. Her family's money alone made her a newsworthy object, and from day one she was dubbed the richest girl in the world. Before she could even grasp what that meant, Doris was featured in newspapers all across the country, and stories doing things that you would imagine rich little girls did. For instance, she was going on 3 years old when she was photographed for being the flower girl in a high society wedding. The wedding was in June, and the papers were all writing that she was 3. She wouldn't turn 3 until the end of November, but the mistake was understandable because Doris was so tall for her age. I mean, she stood 6 feet tall by the time of her debutante ball in 1930. Though, as a 2.5-year-old, she was photographed from the back, and it was her cousin's wedding, Doris was the star of the show, and the news articles started off with talk about Doris. Mary L. Duke was marrying Anthony Drexel Biddle Jr., and the only thing about their union that matters for the context of this story is that there was a lot of money marrying a lot of money. So it only made sense that the richest little girl in the world would be the flower girl at this event. When Doris wasn't out doing society events as a toddler, she was at Duke Farms. her father's New Jersey estate that sat on 2,700 beautiful acres. But her social calendar was relatively full. The year following her cousin's birthday party in 1916, when she was 4, Doris's picture was in the papers again, when she attended a birthday party for her 1-year-old cousin, Angier Duke, who was called the host of his 1-year birthday party. The table was full of children whose parents had big names and bigger money, like Letta Clues. I plan to cover her uncle in an upcoming story, but back to Doris, rich girl activities as you would expect. So many of the facets of her life revolved around her family's money. That would become painfully evident when Doris was 12 years old and her father died. From that point, she would have to grow up quickly and start making some adult decisions. Because the moment her father died, the young heiress became a millionaire. Surely her father, James, understood the gravity of her new fortune, for he left these last words to his daughter: "Trust no one." If Doris had taken heed to those words, this would be a very short video. Instead, we will discuss a number of people she trusted, whom she probably should have not, and a time or two that Doris herself should not have been trusted. When James Duke died in 1925, his estimated net worth was roughly $100 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's the buying power of a bit more than $1.7 billion today in 2024. Now, all of that money didn't go to Doris. And what she got, she didn't get all at once. Some of that fortune went to Nanaline, Doris's mother, and some of it went to the Duke endowment. With the money matters surrounding her father's death, Doris had to become an adult practically overnight, and at the age of only 14, she had to sue her mother. The lawsuit had to do with real estate that James Duke had owned. Doris's mother wanted to sell his Manhattan mansion, and Doris didn't want her to. So, with the help of her guardian, Doris sued her mother and other executors of her father's will, and she won. The 14-year-old Doris Duke, who had a net worth of $2 million in her own right, was now the owner of a mansion worth $1.6 million and all of its contents. And you know that they didn't furnish that place with wares from Woolworth. It was full of priceless art and furnishings that would only increase in value. So what Doris won was worth way more than the $1.6 million price tag on the house. Her next monumental newsworthy moment happened in 1930, when Doris turned 18. It was time for her debutante ball. These still exist today in America, but mostly for younger children around 13, and they have more to do with etiquette and manners. In Doris's time, the debutante ball was all about being presented to high society as a young woman who was worthy for marriage and in search of a high society eligible bachelor, hopefully as rich or richer than she was. Well, Doris would have had a hard time finding a match who had as much money as she did. She was the richest girl who came out in her season. She came out the same year as Barbara Woolworth Hutton, who was also very rich, but not as rich as Doris. Doris was the richest. Barbara was the prettiest, according to all of the papers. The two young women had known each other for most of their lives and had been friends. But as they got older, things that gossip reporters wrote and romantic partners would come between the two ladies. Many of you have asked me to make a video about their feud after seeing my video about Barbara Hutton, and I will make that video. But first, I thought that it was important for us to get to know Doris a little more deeply. So back to her debutante experience. And I have to correct myself and call it that because Doris Duke was presented to society on 3 separate occasions when she turned 18. The first time was at her family summer home called Rough Point in Newport, Rhode Island. The second time was in London, the coming out presentation at Buckingham Palace, where she curtsied to King George and Queen Mary. And the third and final ball was back at home in New York. Of all of the qualities and characteristics that were written about her as to why she would make a suitable match, Doris's money and material possessions were always the main focus. For most of the other young women, it was about how beautiful they were and how charming they were. Over and over, news columnists wrote about Doris's $100 million, her mansions in New York and New Jersey, her private Pullman car that had her name gilded on the side of it, her cars and her horses. And oh yeah, she liked to swim and play tennis, but who cared about that stuff? She was filthy rich. But one thing that I also saw highlighted from time to time was that neither Doris nor her mother flashed their wealth. Of course, she had expensive things, but she was never showy. For instance, on one of the voyages that she and her mother made to Europe, writers remarked that the ladies booked first-class rooms, but not the biggest and most ostentatious cabins on board, even though they certainly could have afforded them. Doris seemed to live in this type of practical manner for a good portion of her life, which set her apart from most heirs and heiresses of her time. Usually, the parents or grandparents would make the fortune, and the children, or maybe the grandchildren, if the money lasted long enough, would spend it and never increase it. Doris was the exact opposite. She multiplied her father's wealth throughout her lifetime. This was all the more impressive when you consider that Doris came into more and more of her father's money during the Great Depression, a time when even men who had been rich for decades experienced financial ruin. And the Great Depression was the backdrop for Doris's debutante balls. There was poverty all about the nation, and poor Americans were finding it hard to get into a celebratory mood for the daughters of the families who they felt were hoarding the country's wealth. I'm sure that most of us who enjoy this side of history know exactly what the Great Depression was, but briefly for those who don't, it was the most severe and longest economic downturn that the world had ever faced. Many in the country lined up at soup kitchens to get free meals. Homeless people slept under what was called Hoover blankets. That was the newspaper or cardboard that they were able to find on the streets. And a lot of people who weren't homeless weren't faring much better than those who were. If they were lucky enough to not have to sleep under cardboard, they might have been so poor that they still needed cardboard, but to use as the soles of their shoes. So I'm sure that we can all imagine how much they cared about uber-rich girls like Doris Duke spending thousands of dollars on parties, food, and fancy gowns. But it wasn't just the poor and homeless people who were against Doris. So were some members of the press. Kind of. For instance, on June 27, 1930, the Daily News had printed a story about a number of the debutantes of that season. The story ended with a warning for Doris, but a bit of an insult. She was told to beware of fortune hunters. She, in particular, because she had the biggest fortune, and would therefore be the biggest target. Then, there was a warning about those fortune hunters who were told that Doris had common sense and an education and, quote, a chin of such strength and determination as to prove her ability to care for herself. Zoinks. Doris actually had a long, strong, pronounced chin, a facial feature that she did not admire in herself. Fellas, lean in closely. I have something very important to tell you. If you meet a woman who you like, and her chin is as strong as Mike Tyson was in the 1990s, even if you love it, compliment her on something else. Women generally don't like to be told that we have strong facial features or Jay Leno chins. This public service announcement has been brought to you by me. Now, in 1933, when Doris turned 21, she got a big installment of her daddy's money, $10 million. She would receive 2 more payments from the trust when she turned 25 and 30. But at the age of 21, she had a lot of what most people didn't. Cash. It was still the early stages of the Great Depression, and at a time when even $1,000 would have been life-changing money, Doris wasn't exactly happy about receiving this $10 million. And as the Daily News wrote about it, her inheritance was the only thing that people should have held against her. Quote, There's no reason why anybody should have anything whatever against Doris Duke, except the $50 million she didn't do a thing to get, except to be born." End quote. But as for Doris, having her fortune made her paranoid and unhappy. She felt like people were always watching her, looking for an opportunity to steal from her. She would walk the streets of New York in disguise. Doris took joy from philanthropy at an early age. And there were a few poor families she would take care of. She would often visit them to give them money. She was almost always incognito. The only reason that word got out about her charity to these families is that private detectives were always following Doris and reporting her every move. It's kind of sad that she wanted to give privately, but even that kind gesture was ruined because some people were obsessed with knowing her every move. But even when Doris showed up to society functions where she knew cameras would certainly be, she shied away from having her photos taken. She simply did not like the spotlight. She would duck and dodge and hide her face when she saw news cameras. And even at home, she would receive crank letters that sent her into such a tizzy that her mom would have to take her out of the country on long ocean voyages. But that didn't stop their private detectives from following her. Whether she wanted to be one or not, Doris was a celebrity. Simply being a multimillionaire made people celebrities back then. And because she was so rich and most people were so poor, it was in fashion to hate her. When she wasn't being stalked by fortune hunters, the press, and private detectives, she had to put up with disturbing letters at home. The papers back then called them crank letters, and it's used kind of the same way that we might say prank letters today. The letters were from anonymous people threatening bodily harm and worse to Doris if she didn't send them lots of money, and there was never just one letter. There were always several at a time. But these kinds of letters weren't anything new. Not so well-off people had always tried to trick rich people into sending them money. So why was Doris having mental episodes over these so-called crank letters? Because of the Charles Lindbergh Jr. kidnapping. Many of us know this story, but some of us don't, so briefly. Charles Lindbergh Jr. was a baby who was abducted from the home of his wealthy parents in New Jersey just months before he turned 2 years old. Though no motive was ever clearly established, the thought was that the kidnapper's motive was ransom. He wanted to be paid in exchange for the return of the child. Unfortunately, the child did not survive. His corpse was found a few miles from his home, and a German immigrant named Bruno Hauptmann was charged and convicted of the kidnapping and death. He was sentenced to death and maintained his innocence even until the day that he had to sit in the electric chair. After consuming so many stories about the poor Lindbergh child, Doris was afraid that someone wanting money would possibly kidnap and kill her too. Her mother was afraid of this possibility as well, so she often lied about Doris's actual net worth, claiming that it was much lower than it really was. And I'm getting ahead of the story here, but Doris had this fear for the rest of her life and kept money set aside for ransom until the day that she died. Now, I don't know how helpful her mother's lies would have been. No, Doris doesn't have $50 million in the bank, she only has $20 million. Like, lady, that's still a lot of money. It didn't matter what she said. The press just wouldn't allow her to rewrite history about her husband's enormous fortune, even for the sake of protecting her daughter. Papers would print over and over what had been public knowledge at the time of James Duke's death, and that was that he had left behind over $100 million. But was the story of the Lindbergh baby lingering in Doris's mind the only reason that she couldn't enjoy her wealth? Maybe it was something else that her father had said just before his passing. We know that he told her to trust no one, and that statement alone can add a sense of paranoia to daily living. But he also said this, quote, "Nothing makes people unhappier than luxury. Satisfied ambition is an awful thing. How can you be happy if you are not busy?" End quote. Could her socialite lifestyle have been a contributing factor to Doris's unhappy days? If it was, she set out to fix that in her early adult life. She spent hours learning, whether it was reading, swimming, or horseback riding, just learning something new, learning how to do something. She didn't just sit at home in her fine dresses waiting for the next party invitation to arrive in the mail. And she didn't spend her time and money shopping for things that she didn't need just because she could, just because she had the money. Doris's father had a complicated relationship with money, but it worked for him, and Doris seemed to understand it as she got older. James Duke always wanted his daughter to be financially secure, but he also did his best to see to it that money didn't make a difference to her. So her self-worth would never be tied to how much money was in her trust or in her bank account. And it really seems like he achieved that balance for her with his teachings, even long after his death. Doris studied French and Italian, rode her horses, danced, attended Bible school, and did all that she could to fill her days and not be one of the idle rich. All of the wild spending, partying, and drinking that took place in the Roaring Twenties, all of the things that were associated with the flapper girls, all of that was stuff that Doris had completely missed. She wasn't introduced to anyone on the so-called party scene until she had her debutante ball, and she wasn't impressed with any of it. Doris was a homebody. She grew up rather sheltered, and she seemed to like her life that way. Her mother had kept her so far removed from the party life that by the time she was introduced to it, the other young people in her set thought that Doris was stuck up because they didn't know her and she kept it to herself. She wasn't doing it to be snooty. She was just really shy, and she had very few friends. The few who were rather close to her called her Dee Dee. And Doris was especially shy around boys. She had no close male friends, and certainly no boyfriends. She was never around boys or young men until she was presented on those 3 debutante society occasions in 1930. And by the time she was around young men who were looking to court young women and then marry them, she just wasn't what they were interested in. Her father's advice to trust no one came in handy when she was presented in London, because there she was surrounded by fortune hunters with noble titles and not a penny to their names. Her wariness of people paid off for her big time in that situation. Doris had always been cautious of people who tried to make fast friends with her, and that London crowd was full of bright-eyed men with empty pockets who were competing for her attention that season. Her father's words stayed with her. Now, I know that I've already told you that Doris wasn't big on shopping, and as a rule, that was true. But there were a couple of exceptions. She did like to shop when she was in London and Paris. Not so that she could spend a lot of money on foreign designer goods. She liked shopping there because she was not as well known, and she felt like she was charged fair prices for what she bought. But a fair price wasn't enough for Doris. When she found something that she liked, she would negotiate down to the price that she wanted to pay. She knew how to hold on to her money. Here's how she talked about it. Quote, "I wish I could go into a store and shop for things just as any other girl. When people know who you are, prices usually go up twice as much. People wouldn't have money long if they didn't ask how much things cost and then refuse to buy half of them." End quote. Sounds like she had her head on straight to me. Once she was introduced to the party scene of the 1930s wealthy set, she didn't hate it altogether. Doris really liked to dance. That was an acceptable way for her to meet young men. But even that was a little difficult for Doris because of her height. Remember, Doris was 6 feet tall. And you know that everything was about order and being just right back in her time. Suitable men weren't supposed to be shorter than their dance partners. Poor Doris. Her pool of eligible bachelors just seemed to get smaller and smaller. If they weren't tall enough, their money wasn't long enough. And then there was Barbara Hutton, the pretty one. The two young ladies both came out to society in the same year. Barbara got married shortly after she came out. She was again the second richest one, as the newspapers always called it. Second to Doris in finances, but first to all of the debutantes that year in the looks department. And where beauty was concerned, she beat Doris by a mile. And the newspapers of the day would always pit the two against each other. So, in a story about how Doris Duke was the richest poor girl in the world, because she feared everyone and was afraid to date and marry, it had to be mentioned that Doris was already married to a prince. This comparison of the young ladies eventually went from the papers and into their real-life interactions with each other. But we'll talk about the feud between the richest, Doris Duke, and the prettiest, Barbara Hutton, in another video. Doris's personal life was rather boring. But because she was of age and in the matrimonial market, and nobody had a clue of what her marital plans were, that mystery made Doris interesting to the news media, so they continued to write about her, even when there were no updates. The world would just have to watch her have a little fun traveling and buying fine art until she settled down and found a mate. And she did that in 1935 when she married James R. Cromwell. James was a businessman, diplomat, and an author of books about economics. Doris had been friends with him for 6 years and somehow managed to keep their friendship and budding romance out of the press. So it turns out that her boring teen life wasn't as boring as everyone thought it was. He was older and more experienced than Doris. When they married, she was 23 and he was 38, which means that they started their secret friendship when she was only 17 and he was 32. That seems inappropriate to me, but let me know what you think about it. In addition to their 15-year age gap, James had already been married before. The year before he started his friendship with Doris, he had gotten divorced from his first wife, who was also an heiress, Delphine Dodge, whose father was one of the co-founders of the Dodge Motor Company. James and Delphine had one child together, a daughter. That seems like a lot for a young, first-time bride to take on, the age gap and becoming an instant stepmother. But Doris loved James. She was willing to make it work. The wedding ceremony itself was almost as much of a secret as their prior 6-year friendship turned romance had been. Actually, by the time that the wedding made headlines, it was reported that the 6-year friendship had been a romance the whole time. The wedding took place at the mansion that Doris had sued her mother for when she was 14. Interesting note about their vows. The word obey was completely omitted. Doris and James agreed to love, honor, and protect each other. Immediately after the ceremony, they set sail for their honeymoon, which was to last for 3 months. Though their travel plans were made in secret, meaning that their names were not on the passenger list, they only had a limited amount of secrecy during their travels. There were news reporters on board, and they wanted interviews with the newlyweds. Doris didn't allow any interviews, but she did consent to pose for a photo in her stateroom with her husband. James gave a little more and agreed to a couple of interviews, and it was in one of these onboard interviews that he revealed the couple's 6-year friendship was always more than that. As he said, quote, "Our romance has been going on for 6 years. We met at Bar Harbor in the summer of 1929, end quote. He also admitted that they never got engaged because he said neither of us believed in it. Now, when I read this, that he didn't believe in engagements, I just didn't believe it. So I went to see if I could prove myself right or wrong. Just remember that I said this. But I'm jumping ahead of myself. We're still in the honeymoon phase of the Doris and James union. Which brings me back to his newspaper interviews. He also let the reporters know their honeymoon plans, a trip around the world, starting with Egypt. The final detail of importance James spilled was that he and Doris didn't know where they would live. The gossip writers speculated that it would be Manhattan, but they were wrong. Doris and James made their home in Hawaii. It was their favorite destination on their honeymoon, so they planned to make a beautiful life there. Their Hawaiian home was called Shangri-La. It was a stately concrete structure of Moroccan and Persian architecture set on 4 acres of palm trees. It had only 5 rooms, but also a swimming pool, playhouse, yacht basin, and tennis court. At Shangri-La, James would write his books, and Doris would entertain herself by fishing, swimming, and reading. Even at this juncture in her life, it was the simple things that mattered to her. And I think that Doris's building that home with James is a partial testament to how much she trusted him. Just 2 years after they got married, Doris received another huge payment from her trust. It seems as though she felt safe to share her vast fortune with James. But the public didn't seem to agree with Doris about the trustworthiness of her husband. He had branded himself as a money reformer in the political world, taking the stance that the wealthy should willingly share their money with people who have much less. And boy, oh boy, did the papers have a good time with that. Like, yeah, we bet that you do believe that people who have more money should give you some. I mean, it wasn't like James was poor, but he didn't come from Duke money. Nobody had Duke dollars. And as far as his trustworthiness and intentions with Doris were concerned, his previous marriage to an heiress didn't help his case. It made him look like a fortune hunter. Nevertheless, it wasn't up to the public or the papers to decide whether or not Doris should trust her husband, and she decided to stand by her man. The couple became political and supported President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deal, and it appears that that support was rewarded in the form of a post for James. In 1940, President Roosevelt appointed him to the position of United States Ambassador to Canada. But he wouldn't stay there long, only 142 days, after which James resigned from that post so that he could return to the United States to run for a spot in the Senate in New Jersey. Those kinds of campaigns are rarely inexpensive, and there's no doubt that some of Doris's money was used to help him win. But he lost. And that wasn't the only loss that the couple would face. In 1940, while James was on the campaign trail, the future was looking bright for the Cromwells. In July, James was on his way to Chicago to attend the Democratic National Convention. Doris was at home in Hawaii, pregnant with the couple's first child. She had made plans to return to New Jersey in October to have the baby and to set up care for a number of British refugee children. Well, Doris wouldn't get to make that important trip to New Jersey. Just days before the kickoff of the political festivities in Chicago on July 11th, Doris gave birth to their only child, a little girl. She was born at 3 p.m., 3 months prematurely, and she weighed only 3 pounds. The baby girl died after only 25 hours of living. Her name was Arden. Her name will come up later in this story. What we need to know now is probably what you have been expecting to hear, that the other shoe dropped and James filed for divorce. Not only that, he proved the general public and press right when he asked for a parting gift from his wife. He wanted $1 million. Well, Doris may have been a naive young woman when she married him, but she didn't take his $1 million request lying down, and that probably shouldn't have been a surprise to James or anyone for that matter. After all, this is the same Doris who sued her own mother and won when she was just 14. And of course, Doris had the best legal team that money could buy. One of her attorneys referred to James as a male gold digger who was trying to work $1 million shakedown on Doris. And here's what he meant by that. James filed for divorce first. Then Doris tried to trump him and file for a divorce in Reno, not where they got married. You can imagine that the legal proceedings were crazy, but in the midst of it all, James threatened Doris. He said that he was going to write a tell-all book about her. Not only that, he was going to conduct a series of lectures based on this tell-all book, this expose on his soon-to-be ex-wife. So, if she didn't want the world to know about all of her dirty little secrets, she needed to fork over the dough to her old hubby. The whole situation was dirty. James even had his lawyers in on it. One of them, Saul Rosenblatt, made the public statement that he had been able to prevent Jimmy from publishing this book, but he didn't know how much longer he would be able to control his client. He went on to say that a settlement was what he preferred rather than a messy litigation. When Doris's attorneys asked him what figure he had in mind, that's when Saul said that around $1 million would be good for his client. After Doris stopped laughing, she and her attorneys told Jimmy/James to bring it on. Go ahead and write your little book, because Doris had nothing to hide. Now, even though they didn't think that Jimmy deserved $1 million, they thought that he deserved something. A little something. Here's how Doris's attorney, Perkins, put it in a 1944 edition of the Daily News. Quote, "While in our opinion, some small settlement to Mr. Cromwell on his nuisance value was advisable, we had no idea of recommending anything like the amount suggested." End quote. Nuisance value, my. The truth is, that's just what he had become to Doris at this point, a nuisance. But according to Jimmy and his attorneys, this divorce filing and request for $1 million wasn't about the money, even though he was literally asking for money. He wanted it to be known that he, quote, refused to be abused as a tool and a pawn by the rulers of the Duke millions, end quote. Sure, Jimmy. I don't think that he had a problem with any of that when the Duke millions were supporting his failed Senate run, but a fella's allowed to change his mind. In order to get the public on Jimmy's side, one of his attorneys decided to release this little statement, quote, "It may interest the public to know that Mr. Cromwell is a far poorer man today than when he married Doris Duke." End quote. I'm sure that you can imagine that nobody cared. So here's how the divorce went and what came out about their horrible marriage. Doris accused James of what she called persistent and systematic mental and physical cruelty. She said that throughout the course of their marriage, he had made several attempts to take or try to get her to give him large sums of money, ranging from $1 million to $7 million. Rather than making any effort at reconciliation, the only communication that James had with Doris was to demand money from her, whether it was for his political campaign or personal expenses. And there it was. Her father's words came back to bite her in the behind. Trust no one. She should not have trusted James. He only married her for her money. The only thing that Doris wanted was her name, Duke, and she wanted that from the court. She wanted nothing from James. Frankly, James didn't have anything to give to her. Well, Judge William McKnight gave Doris exactly what she wanted, her name back and a divorce decree. She won by default because James never showed up. The hearing lasted only 8 minutes, and that might have been 7 minutes more than the judge needed. He granted the divorce on the grounds of extreme cruelty and 3 years separation. James had been desperately pushing for his divorce filing in New Jersey. But the whole time that he and Doris had been living separately, he was living in Washington, D.C. So, as the Reno judge saw it, James had no right to demand that Doris show up for a hearing in New Jersey. The judge called out James Cromwell's actions as, quote, a sham and an attempt on the part of the defendant to perpetrate a fraud on the courts of New Jersey, end quote. Doris was so overwhelmed with joy when it was over that she cried out, "It's wonderful," as she shook the judge's hand. But James didn't want it to be over. He wanted to win. He was determined to have his case heard in New Jersey. He didn't think that it was fair that she got her divorce in Reno because she wasn't a bona fide resident of Reno. Well, hello, pot, meet kettle. Because James clearly wasn't a bona fide resident of New Jersey. Nevertheless, he and his lawyers attempted to block Doris's divorce by getting a permanent injunction in New Jersey that restrained Doris from getting this divorce in Reno. But what was he going to do? Out-lawyer the richest girl in the world with his broke ass? Good luck with that. His being broke really did matter as far as their marriage and divorce were concerned. For during their marriage, Doris received the second and third installments of her multi-million-dollar inheritance, and James felt entitled to some of that money. Now, if you've been around since I've been doing these kinds of stories that allow me to look back at old newspapers, you've heard me say that I appreciate that there was no such thing as political correctness when it came to what these news reporters would write back in these times. And I like that. I like it because it gives us a better look at what people were really thinking and how people really talked in those days. It makes the stories come alive and it makes the people more relatable, in my opinion. And sometimes, it makes these stories a little more funny. As a quick side note, I'm bringing up why I like the lack of political correctness in these stories. Again, because a couple of people assume that if I don't like political correctness in news writing, then it must mean that I like the N-word. Now, if that's where your mind goes when I say that I appreciate the straightforward writing styles of yesteryear, seek help. But back to Doris's divorce. This part is what made me think of the whole political correctness / they would never be able to get away with this today thing. In the writing about Doris's court victory, someone felt the need to tell the readers of the Daily News this, quote, Doris was dressed in a blue wool ensemble. She wore no hat and very little makeup. She was accompanied by her secretary, 250-pound Miss Marion Tashal, known here as one who thinks and speaks for Doris Duke Cromwell, end quote. Now, why on God's green earth did anyone need to know how much Doris's secretary weighed? And who verified that? These are the moments that I'm talking about. Can you imagine someone writing that today? They would be in the unemployment line, fired for fat shaming. Anyway, Jimmy would eventually get his day in court, but it wasn't really of any consequence to Doris. She was, for all intents and purposes, divorced. She started living her life. She even started working at a real job. In March of 1947, Doris went to work for the popular women's magazine, Harper's Bazaar. She worked as a writer, earning a whopping $50 per week. Clearly, this gig wasn't about the money. Her $100 million fortune had only increased by this point, but the job gave her purpose. That was what she wanted. And Jimmy Cromwell finally got what he wanted on April 9th, 1948. Kind of. They were already divorced, per the terms of Doris's Reno court action. So he clearly wanted some money, and he got some, but not nearly as much as he wanted. He walked away from the richest girl in the world with an extra $350,000. That was it. He got his money on April 9th, right? Well, on April 24th, he married his third wife. I guess that he needed some of Doris's money in order to properly get on with his life and pay for the wedding. Now remember that James didn't believe in getting engaged, right? This is a side note, but when I looked to find out who his third wife was, guess what I found out? They were engaged before they got married. This 1948 issue of Shamokin News, I think that's how you say it, Shamokin, however you say it, they shared a detail that was smoking hot, to me anyway, when he was getting ready to marry his third wife. Only 2 weeks after his divorce to Doris had been finalized, an announcement was made before the wedding because why? The couple was engaged. his new bride's mother announced the engagement, so it turns out that he did believe in engagements after all. Knowing this detail makes it look like he thought that Doris was an easy target from day one. Did he not believe in getting engaged, or did he not want to announce his plans to marry the then underage girl because the rest of the world would have been able to see right through him? Let me know what you think about that. But by this time in her life, Doris wasn't that same young, naive girl anymore, and she was ready to move on to her next romance too. Little did Doris know that she was jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire with her next and final husband. In May of 1947, just a couple of months into her new job, Harper's Bazaar sent Doris out on assignment to Rome. Her task was to interview the French actress Danielle Darieux. The interview took place in Danielle's hotel room. Danielle's husband joined the ladies. Danielle's husband was Porfirio Rubirosa. Maybe no one in the room knew it during the magazine interview, but Rubirosa would become Doris's second husband not long after the ink was dry on her interview notes. Here's how Rubirosa described what happened after that interview in his own words. Quote, "The three of us had breakfast. She, meaning Doris, seemed lively, jovial, with that je ne sais quoi that American women can have. Little did I know that a few months later, I would be completely controlled by her. Until then, I had been happy with Danielle, but at this moment, things started to change." End quote. And things started to change immediately, because right after this meeting, Doris took it upon herself to send this married man a telegram that read, quote, "When you are finished with Danielle, call me and I will come." End quote. Porfirio Rubirosa took one look at what the paper said was in her bank account and said, "Baby, you don't have to tell me twice. Just give me the address for the wedding altar and tell me what color tuxedo you'd like me to wear, and I'll be there, because this is about to be the easiest money I've ever made in my life." You see, everybody knew about Doris's money, and there was something else that everyone knew, but fewer people said, and that was that Doris was unattractive. At least that's how a lot of men saw her. Remember that her fellow 1930 debutante Barbara Hutton was called the pretty one, and Doris was called the rich one. And it really seems that Doris's vast fortune, plus her sheltered life, insecurity, and deficiency in the looks department made her an easy target for men who wanted to use her. That certainly seemed to be the case with Rubirosa. Looks aren't everything, but to a lot of people, they matter. Even Doris's mother had warned her that he was not attracted to her and only interested in her money. But in his memoir, one of Rubirosa's friends made it clear that he thought Doris was pretty ugly. He explained his surprise at Rubirosa being with Doris in these words, quote, "She was ugly, very rich, but ugly. He was a gentleman. He would never say that." End quote. Doris married him on September 1st, 1947. If you're paying attention, you see that that is the year before James Cromwell's divorce was settled. Her new husband was Porfirio Rubirosa, the man with the big penis. If you've already seen my video about the Woolworth heiress, Barbara Woolworth Hutton, then you might remember a little bit about him. He cheated on Barbara with Zsa Zsa Gabor and had a long string of Hollywood bed partners that included, but was by no means limited to, Marilyn Monroe, Eartha Kitt, Ava Gardner, and Dorothy Dandridge. He's our favorite Hollywood husband because of his long name. What did you think that I was going to say? Get your mind out of the gutter. Porfirio Rubirosa Ariza was a diplomat from the Dominican Republic and an international playboy. He was 39 at the time, and Doris was 34. He started dating Doris publicly right after he divorced his second wife. She was Danielle Deriot, the most famous actress in France at the time. He divorced her in May of 1947. Then, literally in June of 1947, he started showing up everywhere with Doris on his arm. This man didn't waste any time. He spread his love around, and according to the ladies of his time, he had plenty to share. This is the same guy whose male member became the inspiration for large pepper grinders in fine dining establishments all over the world. They called the big ones Rubirosas. After dating for only 3 months, he and Doris got married in a small, private ceremony in Paris. The ceremony was different. Rubirosa was often described in papers as tall, dark, and handsome. But Doris was taller. And let's face it, people still think that it's a little odd to see a couple in which the woman is taller than the man. Doris, at 6 feet, stood 3 inches taller than her new husband, and as we know, he made up for those 3 inches in another area. But their height difference wasn't the only thing that people might have found to be strange about this wedding. It was performed by a consul general who admitted that he had never performed a wedding, and his nervousness made that quite obvious. Only 10 of the people in attendance were actual guests of the bride and groom. Their guests were far outnumbered by reporters and photographers. The whole thing lasted 10 minutes, during which Rubirosa casually puffed on a cigarette, putting it out just in time to slip the ring on Doris's finger. It was a circlet of rubies, by the way. Another detail that was a little unusual, they had what I think could be considered as a reception before the wedding. Their guests had champagne and cake, and the new groom had 2 whiskey highballs. I don't know exactly what a highball is, feel free to tell me, but they did all of this before the exchange of vows. All of the alcohol seemed to put Rubirosa in high spirits. He was all smiles and laughs, until 2 of Doris's attorneys walked in with papers for him to sign. A prenuptial agreement. Maybe this payday wouldn't be quite as easy as he thought. But after having a few more drinks, enough to get drunk enough to be okay with signing the agreement, he did. Then they had their ceremony, and he passed out shortly after saying his vows. Doris thought that it was all wonderful, bragging to her friends that, quote, "Big boy passed out in my arms," end quote. If she'd had a little more self-esteem, she might have had a problem with a man needing to get drunk to say wedding vows to her. And speaking of the vows, they were another aspect of this wedding that was different. Very different from her first wedding in the regard that she promised to obey Rubirosa. You'll recall that to obey was not a part of the vows in the Cromwell-Duke union, and the fact that Doris promised to obey Rubirosa was such a shock that it made headlines. Well, the marriage didn't last much longer than that 10-minute wedding, and if Doris didn't want to feel like she was being used for her money in her second marriage the way that she had been used in her first marriage, she started off on the wrong foot. Remember that as soon as Rubirosa left Danielle, he and Doris were an item. Divorces usually take a while, as Doris knew from first-hand experience. Well, Doris didn't want to wait out a long divorce before she could have Rubirosa all to herself, so she paid Danielle $1 million in exchange for a quick, uncontested divorce. And with that small payout, Doris got her Latin lover all to herself. Or so she thought. We'll get there. But a quick side note about Danielle first. We all know that she selflessly gave up Rubirosa for $1 million so that Doris could have her happily ever after. But when Danielle tried to move on and marry the man she was interested in, a French actor named Pierre with a last name that I won't even attempt, it didn't matter for them. Why? Because his mother put the kibosh on their plans. According to Danielle, quote, "His mother said, 'I am a woman with a past. and Pierre obeyed her orders, forbidding the marriage. End quote. Pierre's mother thought that any woman who had ever been with Rubirosa was damaged goods. But I love the way that Danielle summed up the reason that she couldn't marry Pierre. She said that the problem was simply too much mother-in-law before the wedding. Well, we know how that can be, right, ladies? Ha ha. Anyway, by the time that Rubirosa was through with Doris probably wished that someone would have intervened and stopped her plans before they started, because he was not a good and faithful husband to her. But women aren't victims on this channel, so considering how she started her romance with him, I can't feel sorry for her knowing that he was not good to her. And I just know that somewhere in the world, Doris's first husband, James Cromwell, was somewhere wondering why Doris didn't turn on her money faucets for him the way that she did for Rubirosa. So remember, Jimmy Cromwell walked away with a measly $350,000 after having been married to Doris for years. Well, here is just a little bit of what Doris willingly gave to Rubirosa without his even having to ask her. She gave him a check for $500,000. With that, he was already ahead of Jimmy, but she had a lot more to give her new husband. A stable of polo ponies, over a dozen sports cars, a B-25 bomber, a French chateau that was converted from a hotel to a dwelling unit for him, and she filled that chateau with priceless art pieces from Kings Louis XV and Louis XVI. Rubirosa loved his chateau. It was 3 stories high, and he used the 3rd floor as his personal luxury man cave. He decked it out with a regulation-sized boxing ring and a full bar. After his late nights at the Calvados nightclub, which were practically every night, the club's guitarists would bring their instruments to the 3rd floor of his chateau, and they would party some more. His 3rd floor became an unofficial after-hours spot. Rubirosa's butler, Victor, would serve his guests whatever they wanted to drink and breakfast tacos. It must be nice to be married to an heiress who loves you so much that she won't say no to you. I think that author Stephanie Mansfield perfectly and succinctly described the tone of the Rubirosa-Duke union in her book called The Richest Girl in the World, The Extravagant Life and Fast Times of Doris Duke, when she wrote this, quote, "While Doris fell in love with Ruby, he didn't want to be the man of just one woman, and she was not easy. She wanted Ruby to be there always, like a slave, but he wanted to do as he pleased. And she knew this before she married him." End quote. Bottom line, Doris got what she paid for, and what she paid for was a gigolo. And a gigolo can give you one thing, sex. The problem for Doris was that that's what a gigolo gives to other women as well. She found this out for herself when she and her husband were enjoying some time on the beautiful island of Capri in Italy. Earlier in the day, she was out doing her own thing. When she returned to their hotel, she found her husband doing his own thing. She caught Ruby in flagrante delicto. You know, getting it on with his ex-wife, not the one that Doris had paid $1 million to take off of her hands, his first wife, Flor de Oro Trujillo, the daughter of the Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo, Rubirosa's boss. Well, Doris was a fool for Rubirosa, but there's only so much humiliation that even she could take. Immediately after this incident, he recalled seeing a new guest for lunch. It was an attorney, and he brought with him some papers for Rubirosa to sign, an agreement to terminate the marriage at once. The divorce was finalized on October 27th, 1948. They were married only for 1 year and almost 2 months. Ruby walked away with the chateau, by this point 15 luxury sports cars, the bomber jet, a Manhattan apartment, the stable of ponies, a fishing fleet off of an African coast, and $25,000 per year until he remarried. Doris walked away with her name and memories of some really good sex. Even though Rubirosa was literally caught with his pants down, he didn't understand why their marriage needed to end. Because according to him, he and Doris were still seeing each other and being intimate for a whole year after they got divorced. In his words, quote, "This was so stupid because we did not want to be separated. For the next year, all we did was reunite, break, reunite in the back of airplanes in between the United States and Europe." End quote. It seems like Ruby didn't understand that Doris wanted to have him all to herself. She couldn't have that while she was married to him, and you and I know that she was sharing his baloney pony after they got divorced. But in Rubirosa's mind, he was just a good guy who was performing a public service for this lonely, homely heiress. Really, when you hear his own words, he comes across as though he thought he was doing the Lord's work when he married Doris. Here's what he had to say, quote, "What I did is better than most people do. They go out with a girl from a good family, they take all her money, and then they leave her. The difference with me is that I marry her, give her the best time in all the world, and when I leave her, she is richer than ever before." End quote. What a great guy. You're still with me, so I may as well give you one more quick side note about Ruby. It's about him, but it relates to Doris too. Zsa Zsa Gabor couldn't wait for her chance to get in bed with Rubirosa. But the reason that she wanted to have sex with him had everything to do with Doris Duke. Here's the thing. Zsa Zsa had commented publicly in Los Angeles that she would like to have an affair with Rubirosa to get revenge for the relationship that her husband, George Sanders, allegedly had with Rubirosa's ex-wife, Doris Duke, in 1952. The thought of someone cheating on the very glamorous Zsa Zsa Gabor with Doris Duke seemed a little off to me, so I went to see if I could find anything that might suggest that this was actually true, and I found it. On August 22nd, 1952, the Evening Sun printed a story about a new Charlie Chaplin film that had opened, and there were a few strange couples there. Among them were Doris Duke and George Sanders, and this was very strange, seeing that he was out in public on a date with Doris Duke, considering that at this point, he was Zsa Zsa Gabor's husband and had been for the past 3 years. So in Zsa Zsa's mind, a little fun in the bed with Rubirosa was for payback, even though Doris had been divorced from him for a few years by the time Zsa Zsa got to him. And I have to say that I think that it's odd that she was only interested in getting revenge on Doris and not her husband, the one who had cheated on her. Well, Zsa Zsa went on to have her affair with Rubirosa, but that hot sex came with a side of physical abuse, as was evidenced when she came out in public with an ice pack, covering a black eye that Rubirosa gave her when he punched her in the face during an argument about the next woman he planned on marrying, Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress. But Zsa Zsa found no fault in Ruby for her black eye. As a matter of fact, she was quoted as saying, "Ruby loves me. Rubirosa in Spanish means red rose. For me, it means black eye. A man only hits a woman if he loves her deeply." End quote. How sickening. And I'm pretty sure that red rose in Spanish is rosa roja. But there are so many other things wrong with that statement that part doesn't even matter. I digress. Zsa Zsa wasn't the only woman who found no fault in Rubirosa. I'm skipping ahead of myself a little bit, but I should mention here that Doris Duke also never had a bad thing to say about her cheating Latin lover husband. And that's according to Doris's longtime friend and fellow socialite, Lucy Douglas CZ Guest, who shared that when Doris died, there were only 2 photographs next to her bed on her nightstand. One was of Louis Bromfield, the other was of her precious Porfirio Rubirosa. He was her second and final husband, but that doesn't mean that she lived the rest of her life without attention from the opposite sex. Doris had a number of high-profile romances. There was the U.S. Army General George Patton, the actor Errol Flynn, and the Pulitzer Prize novelist Louis Bromfield, and jazz pianist Joe Castro. We'll talk about him a little more in the upcoming video about the lifelong feud between Doris Duke and Barbara Woolworth Hutton, because they did fight over him. But here's what I'll tell you about him right now. Their romance was so weird, and they likely both got into it with ulterior motives and not so hidden agendas. Doris met Joe Castro in 1952. He was 15 years younger than she. He was in his mid-20s and she was in her early 40s. Now, before I go any further, I know that someone is thinking, "That's the same age difference she had with her first husband. You said that was wrong, but you'll say it's okay for her because she's a girl." You know, the whole, "so it's okay when a woman does it but not a man" thing. I have seen those comments on videos in which I've held women accountable, and for the record, I think that Doris was inappropriate too, only slightly less inappropriate because Joe was an adult when they met. She was just a teenager when James Cromwell started having secret conversations with her. But just so you know, we don't do double standards here on Ty's Hot Mess History. Anyway, within months of meeting, Joe and Doris were living together at Doris's suite at the Bel Air Hotel. It does come across as though she was looking for a plaything in the bed, and he was looking for a sugar mama, and Doris had a lot of sugar. Doris admired his talent on stage, but she didn't like all the attention that he got from the young, pretty women who would come to watch him perform. This would set off her insecurities and send her spiraling into alcohol and drug use in order to deal with how she felt. Why she wouldn't let him go is beyond me. Their relationship stopped being fun as soon as it started. But maybe Doris, who had always been called the ugly one or the less attractive one, had something to prove. Like that she could keep this young, handsome man on her arm. She and Joe would get into fights. Frequently. Breakup and makeup. Then, Doris's mother died in 1962, leaving her $250 million. Thus, 250 million more reasons for Joe to stick around and pretend that he was interested in Doris. One night in 1963, at her Shangri-La home, Doris was playing her piano, and Joe made a joke that insinuated that her playing wasn't so good. Her response? She grabbed a butcher knife and slashed his arm. This woman was unhinged, and you're about to see that Joe was definitely not an angel. But slicing someone with a knife just because you don't like something that they said? That's more than an overreaction. That could have been fatal. Could Doris have killed someone over a disagreement? I think that she could have, and it looks like she did, and we'll get there. But back to her and Joe Castro. Yeah, sure, she sliced his arm because of his joke. But maybe on New Year's Day, she had turned over a new leaf and was ready to deal with this toxic relationship like an adult. Because on January 1st, 1964, she rang in the new year by throwing him out of her Bel Air mansion, Falcon Lair. And he didn't like that. He loved her house. He went so far as to sue her for wrongful eviction. When he saw that nobody cared about his lawsuit, he turned it up a notch, filing for divorce and requesting alimony payments for Doris in the amount of $5,000 per month. Everyone was shocked to hear about this divorce, but no one was more shocked than Doris. You know why? Because she said she had never married him. This unemployed bozo completely made up this lie and had the nerve to sue Doris on the grounds of cruelty. Even the newspapers were expressing their shock because their first time hearing about this marriage was when Joey announced the divorce. They didn't know how they could have missed a story so big. Then he took his last chance at a money grab and decided to sue for the butcher knife slicing. He wanted $150,000 because Doris tried to kill him and left him with a scar that was so big that he could no longer work. Now, I don't condone her slicing him at all
under those circumstances, and she should have had to pay him something for that. But he was laying it on pretty thick by saying that he couldn't work anymore. In the end, none of his claims mattered. Doris's attorneys strong-armed Joe into silence, and he dropped all of his lawsuits against her. But Doris countered his lawsuits with one of her own, and on May 1st of 1964, she obtained an order from a court in Honolulu. It was a restraining order, an order that restrained this fool Joey Castro from saying that he was her husband and that she had ever married him. Now, one would think that after all of that, this relationship would have been over, but no. Doris still wanted Joe, so she made a lot of promises to him, saying that she was going to do all kinds of things to help take his music career to the next level. It seems like she dangled those promises in front of him to keep him around, because she knew that he would not have come back otherwise. And her promises worked. He agreed to go back to her. So he's not an innocent victim in any of this. He was, after all, a grown man, and by this time in his 30s. If at any time he didn't like how Doris was treating him, he was able to leave. But Joe had gotten rather comfortable staying at Doris's house. Even if he wasn't attracted to her, he thought that her home was beautiful. And he spent a lot of his years with Doris in that beautiful home, not giving a care about his career. The couple had settled into a dreadful rut. By the very next year, 1965, he was back living in her Bel Air home. Why? Because desperate Doris had set up a recording company just for Joe. And this is so pathetic, but in order to get her man back, she promised to include him in her will. Can you imagine? She also bought him a new Mercedes-Benz. She was literally trying to buy his love. Then, tragedy struck that summer when Doris's ex-husband died. Porfirio Rubirosa was killed when he crashed his Ferrari in Paris. Doris was a wreck. Joe couldn't comfort her because he didn't care about her. So she started spending more time with her friend and confidant, Eduardo Tireya. He was Doris's art buyer, but he was also one of her closest friends, and he cared for Doris, even if none of her husbands or boyfriends did. While Doris was mourning the loss of Rubirosa, Joey was hitting the town with young pretty girls in Hollywood, making Doris look like the fool that she was for him. She got really angry about one young beauty specifically, a singer named Loretta Haddad. A number of people had seen Joe and Loretta out and about, looking like a romantic couple. Then out jumped the vindictive side of Doris that was tired of repeatedly losing to women who were more attractive than she was. She really hated that her money wasn't enough to control the men who she wanted to love her. So, Joey had to pay. And how did she make him pay for making her feel bad? Doris shut down his record company. Then, Doris had to pay, because that made him angry. And how did he make her pay for taking away his precious record company that made him feel like the big man in Hollywood? Joey effed up her house and physically abused her. I mean, he really went wild. He threw stuff all over the place. He broke dishes all over her kitchen floor. And while standing in the frame of one of her French windows, wearing a t-shirt only and nothing on his bottom half, he urinated over the railing and into her garden. Doris had called one of the guys who worked with him at the now shut-down record company to help her, to get Joe and take him away from her house. His name was Peter Brook. When Peter got there, he saw all of the destruction. He witnessed Joe and his half-nude body relieving himself onto Doris's flowers. Then he saw Doris in her bedroom with a broken jaw. Joe had hit her in the face and broke her jaw. Joe Castro and Doris Duke were two disgusting people to each other who should have never been together. He thought that he would be able to pretend to love her and get all of the money that he wanted from her, while dating and sleeping with the women he actually found attractive.
and she thought that her money and the opportunities that she could provide him would allow her to control him. They were both wrong. The very next morning, she and her good friend, Eduardo de Rea, left California to go to Newport. She didn't have luck finding romantic love, but she had the love of Eduardo. He was a gay man who loved her better than most people she let in her inner circle. Having more money than one knows what to do with seems to be one of the main ingredients to leading a very colorful life. When you're not bogged down with the day-to-day chore of working to keep a roof over your head, you can follow your heart and pursue your passions, or even live a wasteful life. But whatever the ultra-wealthy have done with their lives has always been a source of fascination for quote-unquote regular people. And Doris's life was no different. She traveled the world. She gave a lot of money to a lot of worthy causes. She was enrolled as a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe of Native Americans. She used her Doris Duke Foundation to give grant money to medical research, environmental conservation, historically black colleges, the performing arts, and more. And all of that is wonderful and virtuous. But we don't focus on the good and virtuous stuff here. This is a Hot Mess History channel, and I have to tell you about the hot messes in the lives of people. Otherwise, you could sue me for false advertising. So I've got to tell you about what I believe to be the biggest hot mess that Doris ever caused. It all has to do with a car accident. And thanks to the work of Peter Lance, an award-winning investigative journalist who is very meticulous about how he does his work, I can use the word accident very loosely when it comes to what Doris Duke did with her Dodge Polara station wagon. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to talk about the death of Eduardo de Rea. Eduardo worked for Doris Duke. She hired him in 1956 as her curator of art holdings. As the years went on, the two developed a friendship in addition to their work relationship. He is the man she turned to for comfort after Joe Castro punched her in the jaw. In 1966, he felt like he had accomplished all that he could working for Doris. He was ready to leave Newport, where he had been working at Doris's mansion called Rough Point. His next stop was Hollywood for his new job as a production designer. On October 6, he packed his suitcases, got a night of rest, and planned to go on some outings with Doris on the next day. He was looking forward to telling his friend that she was about to become his former boss, because now he had made it. Hollywood was calling. De Rea had some friends in common with Doris. They were actually worried about him and told him that she would not be too happy about his leaving her employ. It turned out that his friends were right about that. He told Doris about his new job, and she was not supportive at all. To his surprise, she was angry with him for leaving her. Of course, Doris found a way to make his new job all about herself. I'm sure that her attitude shocked him. After all that he had done for her, protected her and shielded her from men who had been cruel to her, he had been her person to lean on, who would listen to her and literally pick up and move clear across the country with because she had to end a bad relationship. De Rea thought that Doris was a good friend to him. He might not have thought much of her as a boss because she routinely underpaid him. You remember all of that turmoil that he went through when she was with Joey Castro. Nobody has to put up with that kind of stuff on a job. How much was his bonus for dealing with all of that stress and strife? He finally had a great opportunity to make a fair wage and a name for himself doing something that he loved, and all that Doris could think about was herself, and how she didn't want her friend to leave her. The next afternoon, on October the 7th, when De Rea and Doris were getting ready to leave Rough Point, he was stopped by Doris outside of the house. She wanted to talk to him. The discussion quickly escalated into an argument about his leaving her. Some of Doris's staff members could hear the argument because it was so loud, and it lasted for a long time. Everyone seems to agree that those are the facts of the story up to this point. From here, I'll tell you one version of what Doris said happened. Then I'll tell you what Peter Lance discovered, and seems to be the truth because there are witnesses and, frankly, it makes sense. According to Doris, she and Tirea were leaving the house. They were in the car, driving up to the gates that would have to be opened so that they could leave. He was driving. He parked the car but left it running because he was just getting out to open the gate. Doris, who had been sitting in the front passenger seat, then moved into the driver's seat. Her plan was to drive the car forward to the gate to pick him up after he opened the gate. Once she was in the driver's seat, she released the parking brake and put the car in drive. But when she got to the gates, instead of putting her foot on the brake pedal, she accidentally put her foot on the gas pedal, propelling the car forward, right into Tirea first, then the gates. He was pinned between the gates, which were still opening, and the car. Then the car ran over the gates and hit a tree. He ended up under the car. He died from the injuries he sustained. That's what Doris said. At least that's one of the first versions of her account because her story changed every time she told it. But from there, her money did the rest of the talking. Here's what I mean. The Newport Police Department performed a very brief investigation and ruled Tirea's death as accidental. But it looks as though they just took Doris's word at face value, because when the crime scene was re-examined, it was clear that what was on the scene was not at all consistent with the account that Doris told the police. The Tirea family held his funeral. All of his brothers, sisters, nieces, and nephews attended. Liz Taylor and her husband, Richard Burton, sent flowers. Why? Because he had recently designed a set of a movie that featured the couple. It was called The Sandpiper. Tirea even got to play a bit role in the film. It's so sad to think of how close he came to doing what he really wanted to do for his career. A producer of the movie named Martin Ransohoff also sent flowers, and so did Kim Novak. Guess who else sent flowers to the funeral? Doris Duke. And that's all that she did. It's odd that someone who was such a great friend, as she had told the police she was, wouldn't attend the funeral or at least offer to pay for the funeral. She certainly had the money to do it. After getting the report from the second investigation, Tirea's family sued Doris Duke for wrongful death, and they won. But the amount of money that they received, especially when Doris's 9-figure bank account is considered, was pathetic. They requested $1.2 million, and 5 years later, they were awarded $75,000 when a court decided that Doris had been negligent on that fateful day. Not guilty, because she wasn't charged for committing any crime. For the life of their loved one, 8 siblings were awarded an insulting $75,000. Doris's attorneys fought for her in this case as they always had in the past, and they fought hard to keep the Tirea family's financial compensation amount as low as possible. So despicable. It wasn't put on any official records, but the second investigation basically showed that, if nothing else, Doris was a liar who had lied about the events that led to a man's untimely death. Now I have to tell you about the reinvestigation of this case that was performed by Peter Lance. Remember that I told you that Doris's money did some talking. You're about to find out some other reasons why I said that. I can't share with you every single detail about this investigation because this video is already so long, and Eduardo Tirea's death at the hands of Doris Duke has so much information that it could be its own video. So if you would like for me to cover this part of her story in a deep dive, true crime treatment, let me know in the comments section. But I'll tell you some key details now. In addition to Doris's statement given to police being inconsistent with the crime scene, it was also inconsistent with the injuries sustained by Tirea. She said that she first had him pinned between the car and the gates when she accidentally accelerated the vehicle. that would have crushed his legs. The problem with that was that his legs were not injured at all. After Lance's investigation forced the police department to reinvestigate the crime, another theory that is more likely came to surface. A Sergeant Fred Newton pointed out markings on the gates that suggested Thyrea had been forced up on the hood of Doris's station wagon. There had been skin and blood found on Bellevue right after the accident. Bellevue is the street right outside of Doris's gates where her car turned and hit the tree. Sergeant Newton said that the skin and blood were from Thyrea rolling off of Doris's car. Here's his complete theory. Thyrea went up on the hood of the station wagon before it hit the gate. Then at some point after the gates flew open, she hit the brakes and he rolled off. Then she ran over him and dragged him to the point where he was still underneath the car when it hit the tree. That would account for why the lower gates were pulverized, but his legs were never damaged. Everything indicated that what Doris had done was no accident. Even the tire marks at the scene displayed an indication of tremendous acceleration, not a slip of the foot on the wrong pedal. The evidence showed that Doris Duke hit Thyrea not once but twice with her 2-ton station wagon. Then there was Bob Walker. He witnessed the quote-unquote accident in 1966, but he never made a statement or testified about it. He spoke to Peter Lance about it in 2021 because he was an adult and could make his own decisions. At this point, he was a 68-year-old Marine Corps veteran. But in 1966, he was a 13-year-old paperboy who told his father what he heard and saw that day. His father would not allow Bob to make a statement because he was afraid of Doris Duke and what could happen to his son. As he put it, quote, Doris Duke was a rotten person who had some unscrupulous people on her payroll, end quote. Well, after reading Peter Lance's book in July of 2021, Bob was compelled to go to the police and tell them what he saw and heard on the day that Doris Duke killed Eduardo Thyrea. This caused the Newport Police Department to re-examine the case, even though Doris had been dead for 28 years at this point. Well, just a few short months later, the city manager of Newport announced that the case was closed once again and found to be an accident once again, just like they said the first time. Peter Lance didn't seem to be surprised by their findings, stating that Doris Duke had a large amount of clout in the city in 1966, and apparently she still did, even in her death. It makes me wonder how many high-ups in the city at that time would have been exposed for wrongdoing if the re-examination of this case had come to a different conclusion. After all, right after the accident happened, guess who Doris Duke hired on as her personal physician? The city's medical examiner on the case. Now, I know that most of us are familiar with attorney-client privilege in lawsuits. It protects the information exchanged between a lawyer and a client. Well, that same privilege exists with doctors. It's called doctor-patient privilege. And it sounds like a major conflict of interest to have the medical examiner on Doris's car crash also represent Doris. It sounds like her money really was talking, and the city of Newport liked what it was saying. There were even some very shady things that happened within the police department that seemed to be tied to Doris's money and connections. It all looked so bad and ran so deeply, it's likely that her blood money is still running through the veins of Newport today. There are so many more parts of this story that make Doris Duke look dirty. I can't cover them all here on this particular video. The death of Eduardo Thyrea really needs its own video. But it seems that Doris knew that she literally got away with murder, and whatever conscience she had was eating away at her. So she started really turning up the heat on her financial contributions, as if she was trying to buy her way out of all the bad that she had done. Well, let's fast forward to 1987, when she hired Bernard Lafferty as her new butler. Bernard was an Irish immigrant who came to the United States in 1980. He found work at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Pennsylvania, where he met a number of rich and famous women, and even became friends with some of them. Elizabeth Taylor and Sophia Loren were a couple of his fancy new friends. His ponytailed hairstyle and earrings in each ear definitely gave him a signature look. He had a taste for the high life and couldn't get enough of being around celebrities and extremely wealthy people. So he must have felt like he struck gold when Doris Duke, the richest of them all, chose him to be her new best friend and bring him to her house. By this stage in her life, Doris had turned into a weirdo who had her pet camels living inside of her mansion. And they weren't house-trained, if you catch my drift. So Bernard the butler was just one more new weird item to add to her strange collection. He didn't make sense, so he made sense for her. He was her friend, but he was also her personal butler at her New Jersey estate. She hired him right after he had been fired from his previous position for drinking on the job. But his new job with Doris came with perks. Just the type of perks he liked. Traveling worldwide with Doris and staying in the best hotels and eating at the finest restaurants. All that he had to do was whatever she said and be her best friend. It was a better job than he could have hoped for, considering that he had no formal education and he was only semi-literate. Because Doris lived her life so privately in her last years, a lot of what has been said and written about her relationship with Bernard can be chalked up to speculation, but it does seem that they had a good friendship. I have to guess that that's true, because she didn't kill him. No, they traveled the world together for 6 years and he remained right by her side till the very end. Many say that his actions helped her get to the end a little sooner than she otherwise would have. Doris's end might have come as a result of her no longer wanting to be the ugly girl. We know that from the time that Doris was a young woman, she was always considered to be the ugly one. To her face, behind her back, and even publicly sometimes. So maybe that's why when it came to getting facelifts, she was a regular patient. The older she got, the tighter her skin got, to the point of looking unnaturally uncomfortable. One Newsweek writer even wrote that it looked like her skin had been pulled so tight that her eyes were on the sides of her face rather than in the front. But none of that stopped Doris from doing what she thought made her look better. At the age of 79, she got her last facelift, and that was the first step in a domino effect that would end her life. She had her skin stretched to the hilt by something called a magnetic rejuvenation machine. It sent electricity through her skin that tightened it and made her feel pretty, even if no one else agreed. Her money, her face, her choice. This procedure was no joke and required some downtime for recovery. While she should have been laying down and taking it easy because she was heavily medicated, Doris stood up and tried to walk. She didn't get far before she fell. The fall broke her hip. Of course, that injury required surgery, which was the last thing that she needed to happen considering that she was already in pain from the facelift. And we know that the older we get, the harder it is to recover. Well, that all took place at the end of 1992. Doris rang in 1993 with yet another surgery in January. This time it was a knee replacement that kept her hospitalized until April. Then in July, she got so lucky that she had to have another knee surgery. She stayed in the hospital for a few months. Then, the very next day after she returned to her Beverly Hills home, she had a stroke, and it was bad. On October 27th, her physician, Dr. Charles Kevowitz, made a house call and administered morphine to Doris. Allegedly, the morphine was used to put Doris out of her pain, once and for all. It was supposed to end her life. Now, Doris had a lot of servants, and there were a few variations of the story when it came to what happened after Doris received that first dose of morphine. There are too many accounts to discuss them all, but I'll discuss some of them. First, I'll tell you the one thing that we know for sure happened after that October 27th dose of morphine, and that is that Doris Duke died on the following day, October 28th, 1993, at the age of 80. The cause of death was supposedly cardiac arrest. But how could anyone be certain about it? Because the very next day after that, on October 29th, Doris Duke was cremated without an autopsy. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's very odd. Why did she need to be cremated so quickly? It's almost as if someone had something to cover up. And boy, oh boy, did the theories about Doris's death and immediate cremation start popping up from every corner of her mansion. What was being covered up, and who was covering it up, and why? Was it a servant? Was it her doctor? Did a greedy relative or friend have something to do with all of this? It seemed to many who were on the outside looking in that those closest to her were out to get her. The most popular assumption at the time was that the butler did it. Yes, Doris's precious Bernard. I'll explain as many pieces as I can. For starters, the morphine shot that Doris received on the 27th wasn't the only one that she received. According to Tammy Payette, one of the 6 nurses who was on staff during Doris's final hours, after the doctor gave her the first dose of morphine, Bernard asked him how long would it take for Doris to die. The doctor said about an hour. Then he left. But hours later, Doris was still alive, and that seemed to be a problem for Bernard, who called the doctor again and asked him to come back. The doctor returned, administered more morphine. Then Doris died the following morning at 5:30 a.m. By 7:30 a.m., just 2 hours later, her body had been removed from the home. Nurse Tammy said that the morphine didn't help Doris to die easily, but rather that she was in no danger of dying until she was given those large doses of morphine. She made it clear that she felt Doris had been drugged to death. After Nurse Tammy came out with her allegations against Bernard the butler, which also implicated Doris's doctor, many other people came forward with their own allegations against Bernard. Colin Shanley, who had been Doris's chef, said in an affidavit that the day before Doris died, a package arrived, and when Bernard received it, he announced, "Miss Duke is going to die tonight." His affidavit said that there was a lethal dose of the painkiller Demerol in the package. Those accusations alone looked bad enough by themselves, but when you add to them the fact that Bernard the butler had a hearse waiting in the driveway to take Doris's body away for cremation before Doris died, you can see why so many people were pointing their fingers at Bernard and saying the butler did it. Doris was known to change her will as often as people change their underwear. She was always paranoid that someone was out to get her, and she didn't want to fall victim to anyone who wanted her money. Well, 6 months before she died, she made a change to her will that would have made Bernard a very rich man after she passed away. Did his desire for a lavish lifestyle make him want to speed up the process of getting his hands on his inheritance from Doris? It was a great deal of money, too. $500,000 a year for life, and $5 million for his new position as the co-executor of Doris's $1.5 billion estate. This job required Bernard to supervise Doris's many charities. That was odd and seemed like a lot of responsibility for someone who could barely read. But by the time that Doris met Bernard, she was very odd. So maybe this whole setup kind of made sense. Doris was a weirdo who had hired a weirdo to run her operations. So this inheritance only added another piece of the puzzle for those who thought that Bernard had killed Doris. And if they needed any more evidence to support their case, they needed to only look at Bernard's behavior immediately following the death of his dear friend. In addition to having a hearse waiting outside of her mansion like it was a getaway car for a bank robbery, Bernard went to New York very shortly after the death to file the will in probate so that his big checks could start rolling in. And he started spending money like crazy. His biggest purchase was a yellow mansion in Bel Air. What finally happened was that the trial lawyers who represented Doris a year before she died were retained by the executor of the prior will to challenge this will that had been presented by her butler. And after duking it out in front of Otto Preminger's niece, yes, the Hollywood producer's niece, Judge Eve Preminger, is who presided over this case. After that fight was over, the butler got to keep his $500,000 per year, but he was completely removed from the Duke Foundation, the position that would have paid him $5 million up front and given him control of Doris's $1.5 billion estate. That was out for him. But, in good news for him, the county district attorney's office had concluded that there was no credible evidence that Doris Duke was murdered. No one could believe it. 3 of Doris's former employees came together to file a suit against the butler, claiming that they had heard him say that he would kill other rivals for Doris's estate, one of those rivals being Doris's own daughter. Now, I hate to bring up her daughter as a side note, but we know that Doris gave birth to a child that only lived for 1 day, the baby Arden. Well, in 1988, Doris met a lady named Condi Hefner. Condi was 35, and Doris swore that she was the reincarnation of Arden. So she adopted this adult and spent a lot of money on her and took her on expensive vacations. But Doris had fallen out with Condi and removed her from her will several months before she passed away. And after Doris died, Condi fought in court to gain control of Doris's fortune. She gave up the fight when she was offered a mere $65 million from the estate. Not a bad deal considering that she was left with nothing in the will, and Doris wasn't even her real mother, and everyone knew that. Condi is just one of many people who were fighting the butler to get their hands on the money that Doris left behind. Nobody thought that Bernard the butler deserved to have control of all of that money, and many people who were in the inner circle thought that he killed Doris. So even though Nurse Tammy was not alone in thinking that Bernard conspired to kill Doris, she was the most vocal person and the one who pursued the cause through legal channels. And she faced legal repercussions for making the allegations. It's wild because so many people agreed with Tammy and felt like Bernard the butler got away with murder. Then he was able to live in luxury without paying for what he did. But remember what Doris's father said, trust no one. As it turns out, private investigators started following Nurse Tammy, and guess what they saw her doing? Pawning jewelry and other expensive items from the homes of her wealthy clients, and that included items that had belonged to Doris Duke. So was she just jealous the whole time? Would she not have come forth with the allegations against Bernard if Doris had left her a big chunk of change in her will too? I don't know. But I do know that Nurse Tammy Payette had to pay for her crimes. She was sentenced to 8 years in prison for theft. Now you know how it goes in the court of public opinion. Once you're thought to be guilty, you're always guilty. And just because the court system let Bernard run free, most people did not believe that he was innocent. But maybe it didn't matter. Bernard was 30 years younger than Doris. It's likely that he and everyone who knew him figured that he would live his life with his newfound wealth for at least a few more decades. But just a couple of years after coming into his fortune, on November 5th, 1996, at 5:30 a.m., he was found dead in his yellow mansion. He was only 51 years old. He started getting his big-time checks when he was 49. And I literally just realized as I'm reading the script that he died at the same time as Doris Duke. At the end of the day, all of the talk about whether Bernard had or had not killed Doris was just speculation. But what if he really did conspire to kill his good friend and got away with it? How poetic would that be? when we think about how Doris killed her good friend, Eduardo Tirea. Had someone covered up her death the way that she had covered up his? Had someone who she called a friend and trusted killed her? How ironic that would be. After all, there was no autopsy performed on Doris, so it would seem that the investigation would have lacked a lot of critical information, kind of like the first investigation into Tirea's death. This story would have been so much shorter if Doris had only followed her father's advice to trust no one. But I must say that by looking at the way that Doris lived most of her adult life, no one should have really trusted her either. My sources for this story are
South Pasadena Record Archives, 1917. Poor Little Rich Girl, The Tragic Life of Barbara Hutton, by Oceana Tepfenhart for Medium. The Buffalo Times Archives, 1917. Daily News Archives, 1930, 1931, 1935, 1945, 1966, 1967, and 1979. Morning Free Press Archives, 1930. The Tampa Times Archives, 1930. The Brattleboro Reformer Archives, 1930. Star Tribune Archives, 1930. Arizona Daily Archives, 1930. The Buffalo News Archives, 1935, 1966, and 1976. The Journal Archives, 1936. The Kansas City Star Archives, 1938. The Spokesman Review Archives, 1951. Democrat and Chronicle Archives, 1958. Press and Sun Bulletin Archives, 1958. The Peninsula Times Tribune Archives, 1972. The Miami Herald Archives, 1976. Newsday Archives, 1979. And the Sun and the Erie County Independent Archives, 1979. The Buffalo Courier Archives, 1912. Shadow of the Titanic by Andrew Wilson. The Buffalo Inquirer Archives, 1912 and 1916. The Detroit Free Press Archives, 1992. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle Archives, 1912, 1934, and 1940. The Buffalo Times Archives, 1913. Newsday Suffolk Archives, 1959. And the Boston Globe Archives, 1932. The Richest Girl in the World, The Extravagant Life and Times of Doris Duke, by Stephanie Mansfield. The Last Playboy, The High Life of Porfirio Rubirosa by Sean Levi. Homicide at Rough Point by Peter Lance. New York Tribune Archives, 1915. The Evening World Archives, 1916. The New York Times Archives, 1916. The Salisbury Post Archives, 1925. Daily News Archives, 1927, 1930, 1933, 1940, 1943, 1944, 1947, 1948, and 1966. The Buffalo Times Archives, 1930. Times Herald Archives, 1937. Times Union Archives, 1935. Shamokin News, 1948. The Troy Record, 1943. The Buffalo News, 1943. NewYorkSocialDiary.com. Biography.com. NewportRestoration.org. Duke University Libraries Online.
Life Magazine Archives, 1939. The Evening Sun Archives, 1952. The Los Angeles Times Archives, 1964. The Des Moines Register Archives, 1967. The Daily Courier Archives, 1971. Press Enterprise Archives, 2021. Sioux City Journal Archives, 2021. And Philadelphia Daily News Archives, 1964.
This video has been brought to you by me. Well, me and my new YouTube channel, Verified YouTube Guide. Are you just starting your YouTube journey and feeling overwhelmed? Don't worry, I've got you covered. My channel, Verified YouTube Guide, is your go-to resource for practical, step-by-step tips to grow and monetize your channel. It's literally follow-along video tutorials. I'm showing you the steps I took to get 180,000 subscribers on YouTube. So if you don't know how to do something, you can just copy my work one step at a time. From setting up your channel to showing you how you can earn money at any stage on YouTube. And I'm not just talking about YouTube ad revenue. If you have something important to say or a service to sell, start talking about it on YouTube now. Don't wait. Subscribe to Verified YouTube Guide today, and let's build your channel together. You don't have to figure this out alone. The link is in the description box. I'll see you there. I hope that you have enjoyed this tale so far. If you love these scandalous stories from history that make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, hit subscribe and the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Give this video a thumbs up. It's free and helps a ton. Whether you're watching or listening, thank you for letting me be a part of your day.